Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am glad that you guys could join me today, and today I'm answering a viewer's question regarding biblical slavery. Now, the particular issue at hand concerns a dialogue that I had with a particular individual on my YouTube channel, who responded to my video about, because I did a video regarding the slave Bible, and basically the premise and the remit and the scope of the video was to basically demonstrate that despite the prevalence of the idea where people want to say or wish to affirm that the Bible promotes or condones slavery, and because it does so, that it became a good source or weapon in the slavery in the slave-holding community that was used to propagate slavery. And then within the remit of that particular video, I then ventured to discuss that if the Bible actually did condone slavery in the way that people considered it to have done, then it would not have been necessary for them to edit so heavily, right? Like you're talking the vast majority of the Bible completely removed. So you do not edit or modify in any way something that already teaches what you wanted to teach. And you see example of this sort of thing even in modern times. For example, the feminist community has rewritten the Bible. The homosexual community has rewritten the Bible. The communist Chinese government is currently undertaking a project to rewrite the Bible in order for it to be more in line with communist ideologies. And by the way, for those of you that think communism is a good idea and think that you can find socialism and communism in the Bible, well, that proves you wrong, because if that was the case, then the Chinese government would not have to edit the Bible in order to bring it in line. And so after a little bit of a backwards and forwards with this gentleman, he was gracious enough to concede that point and say, yes, I take your point that if it had so clearly taught what the slavery, they wouldn't have needed to do that. And also another thing he was gracious enough to concede, because the conversation started off a little bit rocky. I thought the guy was trolling me, but it turned out to actually be a very, very pleasant conversation, a decent conversation. And if you're watching at this particular time, I thank you for it. In fact, this video is for you. And for those of you that are not familiar with the conversation, the gentleman actually was gracious enough to say, listen, go ahead, because the conversation was getting to the point where it exceeded what you could reasonably do on social media, because you eventually get to the point where you start, because you start making points here and there, it then goes outside the scope. So he said, go ahead and make a video in order to try and do that. And he was gracious enough to say, listen, go ahead and do that. So for those of you that are interested in the conversation, you can go to that particular video and you'll find the comments there. So he was also gracious enough to grant the history of philosophy that the Bible gives. Now, the reason why this is important is because I mentioned certain things about the history of philosophy for the Christians. So for the Christian, the philosophical history is that it involves creation. So creation depicts what God's ideal is. Right? This is what God ideally wants. And then there was a fall, and then everything that proceeds from the fall, however God deals with people, is not always necessarily in the ideal way, because first of all, because humans are evil, they're wicked, and they're doing a lot of silly things, and also because God is unwilling to override human free will, and therefore if he's working with people, it's sometimes necessary to make concessions. And one of his responses was, well, the creation is false, evolution is true, and all of these kinds of things. And I granted him, I said, listen, I understand that for you, evolution and all these kinds of things is true, which is fair enough. However, when we are going to assess a worldview, we have to assess that worldview within its own context in order to see whether it is internally coherent. right? And this is where we stumble upon the idea of presuppositional or apologetics or transcendental arguments, where basically what it is, and I think he granted this because he was astute enough to see that when you are assessing what, let's say you're going to write a book report on the Lord of the Rings, your book report would make absolutely no sense if you excluded Gandalf, for example. So Gandalf the Grey doesn't exist. Then the book report would make no sense. The Lord of the Rings would make no sense. And if you start removing things from that book as a whole, then obviously the story is going to make absolutely no sense. And if we're looking for at least internal coherence, then we have to take it as it is. So Socrates, I believe, he says it is a mark of a wise man that he can entertain an idea without necessarily accepting it. So I asked him, I said, listen, I know you don't accept it, but at least for the sake of the argument, entertain the idea that the biblical narrative is true, and the people writing the biblical narrative believed it to be true, and it's within that context that we need to assess. And then once you've got that worldview, so then you have the Christian worldview, and then you have the atheist worldview. When you are deciding between worldviews, and this is a position I take, not many Christians take this position, by the way, because most Christians accept, as far as I can tell in the world, most Christians accept what they call natural theology, which is very similar to an atheist way of reasoning things, where they look out into the world and try to reverse engineer the history of everything, whereas try to reverse not only the history of everything, but try to reverse engineer morality, ethics, and all of these kinds of things. But for those who are engaged in presuppositional apologetics, we realize that every worldview, before we get to any of the niggly little details, we have to look at the whole worldview as a whole in its own right, as a construct, right? As a construct, and first assess whether it is, before we compare it to other things, first assess whether the worldview itself is at least internally coherent, right? There's no internal contradictions, right? And as a Christian, you would do the same thing with atheism. You look at atheism and everything that it says and believes and affirms, and say, is the worldview at least internally coherent? And if you find that it is at least internally coherent, then you can move on to the next level and say, let's take the two worldviews, right? And this is where you sort of get into a little bit of a scientific method. Let's take the two worldviews and treat them like a theory, right? And then put them up against reality and sort of see how they measure up, and then sort of decide between the two which one seems to fit better, right? And that is basically in a sort of a very basic sense when you're talking about presupposition, because we recognize that at the very rock bottom foundation of every worldview, whether Christian, whether atheist, whether Buddhist, there are presuppositions that you cannot justify outside of something that, for example, let's make an example. And for the gentleman for whom I'm making this video, I apologize if this is maybe a little bit beyond the scope and the context and all that sort of thing, but I really want to try lay down the foundation so that people, and that you yourself as well, can understand where it is I'm coming from. So if we take science, for example, a lot of people, especially the scientistic types, treat science as just as like brute fact, but the fact of the matter is it isn't. There are foundational presuppositions to science that you have to have in place before you can do the science, without which you couldn't do the science, and because you can't do science without them, you cannot use science to justify them, to prove them. So let's take, for example, honesty. Science would not work if you didn't assume that honesty was the kind of thing that you need to plug into the method, so that the scientists, when they get the results, that they're going to be honest in reporting their results. You have to assume honesty before and plug that in before you do science, because Otherwise, it wouldn't work, right? And you can't say, well, let's use the scientific method to justify honesty, because the only way you can use the scientific method is if you assume honesty to be a virtue and a good thing in the first place. And it's the same thing with truth, the concept of truth. You can't, the only reason you do science is because you assume that there is such a thing as truth, and you assume that this is what you're pursuing, right? You can't, and so the scientific method itself is subject to foundational presuppositions which you simply have to assume are true, and so on and so forth. And you find this in everywhere you go, everywhere, whether it's science, and in all worldviews, whether it's an atheist philosophy, whether it's Christian philosophy, there are always those rock bottom foundational things that you simply, in order for anything to work, you simply have to assume they're true. For example, take logic and all the laws of logic. You simply have to assume the laws of logic to be true, because how do you prove the laws of logic by using the laws of logic? You can't do that, because it's circular reasoning, and then it's invalid, and it becomes very tricky. You just simply have to assume, and almost in a pragmatic way. So for example, if you look at Gödel's incompleteness theorem, he says that any system is incomplete in its own right to justify itself. So the laws of logic, we simply have to assume that they work and take them almost on a pragmatic faith. So pragmatism sort of justifies that in a sense. And when you have and then when you build everything up, you then have a worldview. And then if you use what they call the coherentist way of thinking, it's like this justifies that, that justifies, and everything interlocks in a grand mesh. This justifies that, justifies that, justifies that. And we see that when we put all of these things together, does it form a coherent and useful system that we can then use in order to perform certain work and to live life and all of these kinds of things. And that is where we're coming from. So when we're assessing the Bible and all these kinds of things, this is that kind of approach that I am taking, and I appreciate that for most atheists will not have come across Christians that have this kind of approach at all. Right, and so might be a little bit confused when I then. So, for example, here's an example where the conversation itself got slightly confused, for which I apologize. But let's have a look here. The gentleman, he says, because I suggested that because he brought up the usual verses, Leviticus 25 and all these kinds of things, and I said to him, listen, it is not my interest, because personally I'm rather bored with the whole slavery question. It's the in vogue subject today in the political sphere. It's become politically expedient for both the left and the right to just completely just go crazy on this particular issue. And I'm at the point where I'm just completely bored of it, right? I'm really am bored of it. And so when I made the video, it was not my intention to go into all these details, but merely show something that I thought interesting, which was the slave Bible, and sort of assess the implications that the existence of such a Bible actually means for the whole narrative, sort of thing. And so when he brought up as an objection these verses, I said to him, listen, there are other people that ad nauseum, there's like hundreds of other Christian apologists out there who have already addressed this topic. And so this was the context to this particular thing. So he says, I take your point. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong one. So he says the following. He says, I take your point. So he was gracious. I take your point about Adam and Eve, but still confused about your position is on biblical slavery. Initially you said that WYM, so this is what do you mean, very popular, he's a good guy, and he's the one of the guys I referred him to for that gives direct specific answers to those Leviticus and those the usual objectors verses that they bring up. His position was that the Bible only condones indentured servitude and not chattel slavery. However, in your response, you seem to acknowledge that the Bible does condone chattel slavery, but say that God intends this to only be temporary. So, what's going on here, for the sake of the questioner, when I look at all of these issues, right, when we're dealing with slavery, First of all, I always, as best as can, as humbly as I can. I don't always get it right, okay? But as best as I can, it's like there's stuff I don't know, okay? There's stuff I don't know, and I have biases, etc. Okay, and so when we look, this is the modern way of thinking, or the modern way of thinking is what we do is we tend to form a package or a box, and we say if something meets X, Y, and Z criteria, right? So you make a list of 10 or 20 points. If what we're looking at aligns with 10 or 15 of the 20 points, we say, well, then this is what we're dealing with. And so you will have, so for example, you'll have a box for indentured servitude, and you'll have a box for chattel slavery, and then you will have all of the points. But now the thing is, for me, I recognize that some of the points overlap. And you find this with many, many things. So, for example, I'm very interested in psychology. In psychology, let's say, for example, we take cluster B personality disorders. You've got narcissism, you've got psychopathy, you've got borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder. Now, each one of these things, in order for you to be diagnosed, you have to meet at least X amount. You don't have to meet all of the criteria. You have to meet X amount of the criteria in order for you to be diagnosed with one of these personality disorders. But one thing that you will notice when assessing them is that a lot of the points, right, are common to all of them, which is what makes the diagnosis so difficult, and why so many people often get misdiagnosed, because a mistake can be made because some of the traits overlap, and you have to really know your theory very, very well in order to be able to diagnose. And for me, when I say that I allow for their, in the biblical narrative, if I say I'm quite willing to accept that if we affirm that what's in the Bible is indentured servitude, right, and I'm quite willing to accept that some of the features may overlap with chattel slavery, because these definitions, when we're talking about slavery today, we are informed by history that had not yet happened in the ancient times. So our view of slavery and all of these kinds of things today is informed by the Greek, by the Roman Empire, and specifically by the transatlantic slave trade, which happened in America, in the UK, Europe, Africa, and all of these kinds of things, Arabia, and all of those kinds of things. It's informed by that, and so that influences how we define and pass out the different categories and all that sort of thing. Whereas in the ancient times, this history hadn't happened yet, and their practices and their cultures could have well been different, was informed by different periodic things. And so when my preference is to rather go in, instead of going in and saying this is indentured servitude, this is chattel slavery, this is that, rather to take the view, rather forget all of that, just do away with the history that has not happened yet, because we put in our modern, even Richard Dawkins, who is about as vehement a critic of Christianity as you can possibly imagine. Even Richard Dawkins says you cannot assess the past by today's standards. You can't do that. It's intellectually unethical, for lack of a better word. And unfortunately, our modern understanding of these things is not informed by anthropologists, by historians, and things of this kind. These days, our view of slavery is informed by activists, by television, right, by television entertainment, and by politics, right? So basically, by all of the morons that we shouldn't be listening to, rather than by the anthropologists and all of these kinds of people. It's not informed by that, okay? So, by the way, and I'm going to give some book references later, there is a book by C.R. Hallpike. It says, Do We Need God to Be Good? by C.R. Hallpike. He's not a Christian or anything like that. He's a secular individual, an atheist, if I'm not to be mistaken, and he does a very, very good, he's an anthropologist, does a very good job of addressing these things. So that's why if there's any confusion about, am I accepting this and I'm accepting that, the confusion arises over the fact that the person making the objection is attempting to understand which categories I am or am not accepting, whereas myself, I'm less interested in the categories and more interested in a coherentist view, in a holistic view of what was going on over there. And if when we try to categorize it, there are overlaps, for me that's not important. I'm interested in what was going on there in those days, in that time, because when you discuss these things, you have to understand you're dealing with real life people in real life history. We can't deal with it as if we're going to be reasonable and honest, as an abstract thing where we impose our ideologies on top of it, right? Those people had different ethics, different ways to us, and all that kind of stuff, and so on and so forth. So to proceed, I'm going to need to give the philosophy of history, so of Christian history, which is creation, fall, restoration. Okay, creation, fall, restoration. In creation, we see God sets up what is ideal. So a lot of people say, why does God allow evil? The fact of the matter is that at creation, there was no such thing as evil. There was no such thing as suffering. There was no such thing as death. That is God's perfect ideal. That's what he wants. That's what he prefers. And then we've got the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife and your goods, and all of these kinds, dealing with property, dealing with all of these kinds of things. That is God's ideal, right? And then there was a fall. So you basically move from an ideal situation to a non-ideal situation. And now God, if God is merciful, all right, if God is merciful, he's going, rather than saying, oh, well, you've now, I'm just going to wipe you all out because you failed my ideal, right? If he's merciful, he's not going to do that because he grants us free will in the Garden of Eden. And now whether you believe it or not, doesn't matter. For the sake of the argument, let's look at the narrative. In the Garden of Eden, there were 2 trees. There was the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They had access to the tree of life because that's one of the things that allowed them to basically be immortal, okay? And everything was perfect. There was no death. There was no decay. Everything was just honky-dory. Perfect, okay? And God says to him, listen, because you have free will, I have to allow you to choose against me. I have to allow you to walk away from me, because otherwise you're not free. Otherwise you don't have free will. I do not give you the opportunity, or the opportunity to be able to move away from, to reject me, okay? You can't force people to love you. You can't force people to if you want to have a loving and decent you can't force a relationship. It has to be a free will. So he says, and one thing we have to notice, in the controversy between God and Satan, Satan accuses God of being a tyrant. Satan accuses God of being a tyrant and that God's laws are oppressive. This was Satan's accusation. So God says, there is a tree of knowledge of good and evil. You have access to it because they could get to it. God didn't put a fence around it with machine guns and nothing, right? But he's like, you have free will, but if you go there, you will die, and I have allowed Satan access to you because, again, if this is free will, we talk about free speech, right? In the modern ethic, we talk about free speech. Satan, it's almost like the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was Speaker's Corner, right? Like we have here in the UK, there's up in London, you have at Hyde Park, you've got Speaker's Corner, where literally anyone can stand up and say whatever they want. It's free speech. You can go up there and state your case about anything, and people can come and they can debate and they can have a conversation. So the tree of knowledge of good and evil was Speaker's Corner, where he says, Satan, you're not allowed anywhere else in the garden, but at the tree of knowledge of good and evil you have access, and if they go there, if they venture there, you then have access to them, because I'm giving free will. I'm showing and I'm proving that I'm not a tyrant and that I'm allowing free will. But almost like imagine a teacher that at the beginning of the school year she says, I'm going to give you an A+, and it is up to you whether you keep that A+ or not. That's the same thing that God is doing. He's created a perfect universe, and he says, this is a perfect universe. It is up to you now whether you keep the perfect universe or whether you pursue something else. And at the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Satan convinced Eve, said, listen, God is not only a tyrant, but he is withholding something from you. And he says, if you eat of this fruit, if you disobey him, then what will happen is you will enter on a higher plane of existence where you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now, we must understand that the knowledge of good and evil, they already had a knowledge of good. What the knowledge of good and evil means is like you will understand in a personal, visceral way what that contrast is actually like. All right? If you go there, it means you are choosing that knowledge. That's your free will. And Adam and Eve, so Eve went there. Satan gave her his speech. He had his speaker's corner event. He gave her his speech, and she believed Satan rather than God and said, I'm going to freely pick that fruit. And then from there, she went to her husband and said, listen, this was wonderful. I feel so enlightened. Have this fruit. You come and take a bite and internalize this new way of being, right? That's that. Internalize this new way of being. And Eve was deceived because she fell for it. She fell for the serpent's speech, because he said, you will never, God is lying. You're not actually going to die. Right? And we see that in other religious movements where they say you don't die, you're going to live forever as a spirit somewhere. Whereas in Christianity, it's like you will die, right? Because if the only source of life is God, and you unplug yourself from the source of the only source of life that there is, then you're going to die, right? So you can't get mad about that. It's like getting mad about the fact that you die if you unplug yourself from God. And getting mad about that makes as much sense as getting angry with the light bulb if you unplug it from the socket, right? And it goes off, right? The only way the light bulb can be on is if you plug it into the power socket in order for it, because it can't generate power on its own. And it's the same thing when nothing in creation has the power in its own right to generate life on its own. And so if you unplug yourself from the original source, you will then decay and eventually wither out and die. Okay, so getting mad about this makes no sense, right? You can't, it's like, you chose that, you unplugged. What can you do? And so there's the fall, and restoration means God is making a way for you through your free will, because God does not accept anything other than free will. And here, I actually wrote this on here's a quote by Saint Augustine, right? It says the following: he who created us without our help will not save us without our consent. This was Saint Augustine. And so what I find often that when atheists assess the Bible, now please understand, I used to be an atheist, okay? When I was a kid, I was raised nominally as a Christian, right? So my Christian upbringing was pathetic, absolutely pathetic. I was never taught anything of any particular substance. Basically, everyone in the family and in the church completely failed, right? And the vast majority of the people that I grew up with in church, right, all the kids, most of them are no longer Christians anymore. Right? To just show how pathetic it was, right? How many times I went to the pastor to ask a question, whatever the case might be, and I'd be dismissed that I'm a troublemaker and all this kind of stuff. So I rejected, I hated Christianity. You need to understand this. I hated Christianity. So for me to be here as a Christian today, It really says a lot, okay? And then from atheism, I went into Buddhism. Because I bought the books, I owned the books. They're all still back in South Africa. I owned the Quran, I owned the Bhagavad Gita, I owned the Maharaja, which is a little story about the one prince. I've actually still got my Buddhist prayer beads, my stones, these are like mementos that I keep to remind me about where I used to be and where I've gone. So all of these religions, I gave them a good shot, because I realized when I was an atheist that the only way I could either affirm or dismiss anything is if I actually got involved in it and really learnt about it in a proper, fully holistic way. And I realized that, for example, and now that I'm a Christian, I realize that when I was an atheist, I used to make the same objections as you are making, right? And I realized that the only reason at all that I thought that I was correct was because I had never actually properly read the Bible. I'd never done any actual studies. I'd done nothing, right? I was completely ignorant. Right? And so what I was doing is I was imposing a prima facie view on top of the one or two verses that I would read and disapprove of, and then from that just simply dismiss it out of hand. And so let's have a look here what I mean by we're dealing here with a prima facie problem. So here, here's the basic atheist thesis, where they are coming from. And the gentleman did ask me, so if I go to where he because I asked him if he was okay, he says so try to do it justice. So where is it? Would you mind if I did it with France? He says yes. Right, so okay, so please note that my claim is that God and the Bible condone chattel, so and so on and so forth. And I said I'll try to do it justice. And I said, just a question: if it does condone chattel, as you say, what does that mean? So what is the motivation for atheists to bring out this point? And so I'm really going to try and do this as best justice as I can. And I believe that the issue here is that we're facing is ultimately a prima facie problem. Right, so we have, this is the basic syllogism that atheists come, that if I take all of the arguments, says the Bible translations talk of slaves. In the Old Testament, no objection is made to having slaves. In the New Testament, Christians are not commanded to free their slaves, and slaves are actually told to submit. Therefore, biblical texts approve of slavery. 5, we know that slavery is wrong. 6, therefore, the biblical texts approve of something that is wrong. Right? And I think this is a good instinct for an atheist to have. If these verses don't bother you, then you're probably a psychopath. These verses, at first glance, they should bother you, okay? So I've got still a couple of points. Please forgive me if I'm a little bit scattered and stuff like that. I really am doing my best. I don't script these. I've got ADD, I've got Tourette's, which is why, and so please forgive me if I'm not as perfect as I'd like to be. I don't script these because I found that scripting doesn't actually help, and it's terrible. Anyway, so one thing that I think the atheist recognizes well is that a law, right? If God is making these laws, these evil laws, the atheist, I think, recognizes properly, and interestingly enough, many Christians don't recognize this, that the law gives you an idea of the character of the individual who is making the law. So a righteous person will make righteous laws, and an evil person will make evil laws. And that makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. And the atheist recognizes this, which is why he brings up the objections. Hang on. If, you know, what kind of a God you did? This guy, slavery, what the hell, okay? And you think he's great, all right? So that's a good recognition, right? And again, it's the same reason why I rejected the Bible in the first instance. So it makes sense. If you go visit a friend or whatever the case might be, you immediately know the quality of the parents by merely looking at the kind of laws that they put in place to govern their home and the kind of rules that they put in place for their kids. So a parent who allows their children to stay up playing video games until 1 o'clock in the morning, you know straight away this is a bad parent. Parents, however, that make their kids do their homework, that take the time to talk to their kids about, help them with their homework, get to bed at a reasonable hour, eat healthy food, you immediately know, boom, those are good parents, okay? So when we're talking about the law in the Bible, it's very important that we understand, and that the atheist has recognized, maybe without realizing, that the law is a transcript or in a typological sense, gives you an idea of what the character of God is like. And therefore, if it's in bad law, then the person making it must be bad. And if it is a good law, the person making it must be good. Now, here's the thing. When these things are passed, right? These laws are passed. We understand, and this is something I mentioned with this gentleman, we understand that God has his ultimate holy law, the ideal that was done in creation, set up in creation, and also set up given in the 10 Commandments, right? So we know, for example, that the law, thou shalt not murder, existed at creation because, and right at the beginning, because when Cain murdered Abel, it was considered murder and he was exiled. Cain was punished as a result, right? If there was no law, there would have been no punishment, okay? Because the purpose of a law is not only a transcript of what the person's character of life. A law allows you to prosecute an offender. You need to understand, a law does not prevent people from behaving in a particular way, right? Laws do not dictate behavior. Laws simply allow you to govern and prosecute individuals when they break the law, and a law exists to let the people know beforehand, this is what I will allow or tolerate, and this is what I will not tolerate, and at this point I will draw the line. Now, we need to understand a few things. When you are dealing with a law, when you are assessing any law, you are engaging in a practice that's known as jurisprudence, okay? Jurisprudence, the theory or philosophy of law, okay? Now, jurisprudence, basically, you have a law, they write out the law, boom, there it is. And because in my church, I used to be part of a branch called religious liberties, right? I've only been a Christian for about 5 years now, since 2014, okay? Since 2014. And so I've actually been an atheist and a Buddhist and all that other kind of stuff for longer than I've ever been a Christian, okay? So I haven't actually been a Christian that long. So, and in the purpose of the religious liberties branch of my particular church, of my particular denomination, is to interact with legislators in the government so that when they pass laws, what we do is because when a government issues a law or has a law on a bill, before they pass it, they put it out for the public to read the law and to correspond with the legislators to say, this is the process of jurisprudence. You actually have lawyers that specialize in this kind of thing. And as the law is written out, we look at it and say, how is it worded? What will the real life because there's a difference between the intent of the law and once the law is and how it actually plays out in society once that law passes. And the point and the job of jurisprudence is to try and foresee what could go wrong and to try and say this part of the law is not specific enough, it's too broad, it's too vague, and this part of the law infringes on that law and infringes on that law and infringes on that law, and therefore it needs to be modified. And this is the process of jurisprudence. So when you're looking even at the biblical laws, you need to understand that when you look at it just face value, And this is what atheists often do. They simply list, here is the law, there's Leviticus 25 verse 44, boom, there it is, there we go. And the process of jurisprudence goes right out the window. Right out the window. And here's the interesting thing. The jurisprudence is actually written in the Bible, right? The explanation of the parameters under which these laws are to be understood is actually written in other places in the Bible, but they never go there. And it's understandable. It's understandable that the atheist would be unaware of these, because why? Because atheists have no reason really to read the Bible. Okay, why would they? Okay, it doesn't make any sense. But, and shame on Christians, most Christians don't know that these things exist. And therefore, when the atheist makes the objection, the Christian sort of sits there wide-eyed and is like, I don't know. Okay, now the Christian should be condemned for not knowing, but the atheist is actually making a valid point. Okay, sort of thing. So I'm trying to be fair here. Okay, the Christian should be condemned because the Christian should know better. And in my personal experience, for example, if you look at my video, I've got a video series that's called Bible Contradictions, where Sam Harris put out a list of 400 and something Bible contradictions, and I try to go through each one. So far, in every single one of these particular instances, it has simply been a case that Sam Harris or whoever put this thing together simply did not read the associated literature within the Bible that gives clarity on what's going on. They simply don't do it at all. And it's the same thing with Christians. Every time, whenever I go out and I give a lecture or a seminar or a sermon or whatever, and I get these confused things from Christians, every single time I know that it's because the only reason I'm getting this question from a Christian is because the individual has not actually bothered to read the entire, or even read the verse carefully. Interesting example. I was giving an afternoon program, a Q&A once upon a time. This was a year or two back. And the elder of the church said to me, Morgan, here's a verse. I don't quite understand what it means. It's giving me a bit of problem. And I looked at this verse and I looked at him and I said, Elder, the answer to your question is actually in the verse itself. In the verse itself. And he sort of, really? And I said, I'm not going to answer the question. I said, you're going to answer the question yourself, and I'm going to help you do it. So I said, let's read. And only once I sort of slowed him down and said, read each word out loud, word for... And then suddenly, as he went, he's like, oh, it's so clear, right? He had no idea. It's because he didn't carefully read it, okay? So this is how we need to understand these things, the flow through time, so God has the ideal, then he has the fall, and there are allowances that need to be made. If a God is merciful, he will make certain accommodations. That's the point. God is just, but God is also merciful. And here is where I need to make a request of atheists. Atheists, you need to give the whole thing a bit of a break and stop being so dogmatic. Because on one hand, atheists like to say that God is a tyrant and he's malicious. And on the other hand, they want to say, if we say that God makes allowances, then they want to have a problem because God makes allowances. So it's like, do you want him to be a tyrant and a taskmaster, or do you want him to be merciful? Or choose, okay? God is both just and merciful. And it's the same thing. You are a parent. You have laws in the house, right? You're not going to bring down the guillotine every single time your child does something wrong. Because ultimately, what are you trying to do? Ultimately, you are trying to move your children forward, upward and onward. And in certain times of things, you're going to allow certain concessions. So for example, and this is another point that I need to be make. Regulation does not mean recommendation. It's that simple. You're a father, your kid wants to try cigarettes. Do you approve of cigarettes? No. You know it's bad. You know it's going to get cancer, all that kind of stuff. But no matter what you do, the child is just not going to bloody well listen to you. So you say to the listen, right, I'm going to make a deal with you. I don't condone it at all. But I understand that the only way I can prevent you from trying cigarettes is if I exercise overwhelming force and overwhelming authority over you to prevent your free will. right? And a wise father will know that by doing so, he will lose his children. He will ultimately probably drive his child towards that which is not good for him, rather than if he says, listen, I'll make a deal with you. You can try it if I'm around. You can see how you feel, and try to negotiate in that way. It's the same thing with modern laws, right? Our country, we allow, for example, gambling. Does it mean that the legislators who regulate gambling, does it mean that they condone gambling? No, it doesn't. They simply recognize that they can't stop people from doing it, right? And so, because rather than create an underground black market for gambling, it is better to allow it to happen in a somewhat legal way and regulate it, so in order to try and mitigate the damage of that industry as much as possible. Same thing with drugs, right? Let's look at the war. One of the big issues of modern times is the war on drugs. People jump up and down, innocent people going to jail for minor drug this and that, and people who get addicted, because if drugs are criminalized and you're addicted, then you can't seek help in order to get over your addiction, and there's all of these problems. And this is how we need to understand these laws. When you're dealing with a law, you are dealing with real life flesh and blood people. You're not dealing with an ideology, right? That, oh, we can simply ban this and completely ignore the fact that this has real life, real world impacts on people. Okay? For example, let's take the feminists, right? The feminists with the Formula One, the girls that were models around on the Formula One racetrack, okay? Feminists, in all of their superiority and rage, went off and made such a stink that all of these women lost their jobs. Because women must not be objectified, because this and this and this and that. And people rebelled against this. Why? Because A, there's real life consequences, right? Even though the ideology is sound, women should not be objectified, right? I agree. Women should not be objectified. Women should be modest, right? They shouldn't be going out flashing their boobs all over the place. I agree. But what happens if I take my ideology and I impose it and I bam, outright bam, these women all lost their jobs? Because let me tell you, that job is better than prostitution. These women earn fantastic salaries. It was their free will to go and get those jobs. Their free will to go and get those jobs. It was well-paying work. They entered into the contract with the Formula One organizers. They entered into a free will contract, right? So by imposing, these feminists, by imposing their ideology, not only did they interfere with the free practice and the free trade, the free ability to associate and organize contracts between people, they interfered with that process and caused the women to lose their jobs. And that's a problem. That's what happens when you impose ideologies on people. And God understands this. It's the same thing with the drug issue. If we criminalize all drugs, what happens? Vulnerable people get caught up and end up in prison when they should rather not be in prison. People who are mentally unwell, people who are destitute for whatever reason. There's a lot of innocent people that end up in prison for stupid drug laws. Stupid drug laws. So what if people started doing? They've started scaling back and say, we're going to decriminalize it, but instead we're going to regulate it in such a way so that A, we don't create a black market, so that there's no black market. To try eliminate, because why? Because in a black market, you have crime, death, rape, horrible things. So even though we do not condone, it is our preference that no one ever use drugs ever. The fact of the matter is, because we're sinful, because we're fallen, and because there are real world problems that are not fixed by simply banning things, we recognize that there is a real world problem, that innocent and vulnerable people are being affected by things, and therefore, even though we would prefer if no one did it, we can, by banning it, we actually make the problem worse rather than make the problem better. And until such time as people, the population themselves, out of their own free will, can control themselves and stop using drugs, that is the ideal. But we have to allow people that free will to do that. We can't impose and force. It's that simple. So when we're looking at the Bible laws, we immediately understand God has an ideal. 10 commandments. Thou shalt not covet your man's wife, his goods, anything that is thy neighbor's, his body, his labor. This is everything. This is property rights. Okay? This is property rights. Okay? Can't do it. Murder, can't do it. Right? So a slave master, if he kills his slave, does that contradict the 10? Yes, it does. That's the ideal. And so when we see in this particular, when God says, listen, you may do this and may do that, we understand that the language is permissive. And we're going to read it. We're going to go through. The language is permissive. He says, I'm going to, because I understand, here's this slavery and servitude and indentured chattel, whatever it is, it exists. It's a reality of life. Within the borders of Israel, because these are God's people, God can regulate, right? God can't regulate the other cities, right? Imagine America as a Christian country, for example, invades another country, says, you are going to do what we tell you, and we're going to completely override your culture. What would we say? Was this a problem? Okay. What gives you the right? All right. What gives you the right? So God can regulate what's happening within Israel, within Israel's borders, under the influence of Israel. And whatever happens outside is not his problem, because, again, he allows free will. If those people reject him, then he's like, then I'm gonna leave you to it, because you've said you reject me. I have to leave you to it because it's free will. Here's Israel, and Israel is this tiny little nation amongst all of these other people, and at the same time they're going to interact with these other people. So I've got to deal with what I have, because if I'm allowing free will, and you need to understand, what does it take to abolish slavery? We know what it takes to abolish slavery. Look back at the after the slave trade, when it was being abolished in the United States and all these kinds of things. Think about the war, the loss of life, what it took, the financial cost, the cost in lives, and so on and so forth. And not only that, what a lot of people don't realize, if you look at the historical record, you will realize that the West abolished slavery, and when the West moved over to other countries and said, you need to abolish it too, many of those countries said, we're not interested in abolishing it. We don't want to. In fact, there were entire civilizations or groups of people where they existed. So I forget the name of the people. You need to read the following book. Right, so you need to read the following book. Let's have a look here. There's a gentleman by the name of Thomas Sowell. He writes he writes a few books. Actually, let me do this. Thomas Sowell books. So, Black Rednecks and White Liberals and Discrimination and Disparities, right? So, Thomas Sowell. So let me go. Hang on. Let me go back here. So I've got these two. I haven't read the rest. Discrimination, Disparities, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. Thomas Sowell goes into a history of the whole situation. And this is the gentleman here, Thomas Sowell. Okay. Reading his books gave me such a different perspective on the real world difficulties when dealing with the slave issue. So, for example, a lot of people point out that some of the founding fathers of the US, like Thomas Jefferson and stuff, that they had slaves. And they're like, and the leftists, your far left radical types, they're like, oh, well, these people, they want to basically, because of that, they want to demolish his statue and all these kinds of things. When you actually read what he wrote, and you find out that he inherited it, but he didn't want slaves. He didn't want slaves, but he couldn't free his slaves. Why? because there were certain debts and certain legal things that he was bound by the society that he lived in. Two, if he just freed his slaves, right? So now he's just going to free his slaves. They've got no education, they've got no means of supporting themselves, etc., etc. How are they going to look after themselves? First of all, because of this situation that happened, there was a responsibility to look after these people. You can't just say, all right, slavery is abolished, off you go and live like animals, and now you fend for yourselves. You can't do that. You know, what are these people going to do? Okay, it's completely ridiculous, right? It's the same concept. Like today, if someone wins the lottery, right? Someone who generally middle class or lower class, whatever, they win the lottery, 100 million, whatever the case might be, euro millions. What happens to the vast majority of these people? They end up on the streets within 5 years. They're on the streets, worse than what they were before. Why? Because you suddenly throw them into a position that they have absolutely no skills and no way of handling, something they're not used to, and by simply giving the person all of this money, you actually destroy him, right? You completely destroy. So this is the real life consequences of things, right? And Thomas Sowell, man, this guy really opened up my eyes to the subtleties and the difficulties that you couldn't just let these people go. Because what are they going to do? It's cruel, in fact. And so the only thing that could be done was to try and move the society as a whole over to the new ethic, and that's what we're still trying to do today, get so that everyone gets along and stop being prejudiced and all these kinds of things. That's still a work, and God understands this. God understands if I'm going to allow my people free will, I can't go in with overwhelming force and overwhelming anything and impose on them. Because here's another thing, and this is what Christians understand, right? So for example, you have the far left, all these activists going out there and saying we need to stop racism and this and this and this, and we need to force people to stop doing these things. You can't force people to do anything. If you force people, you become tyrannical. You start impeding on free speech, which is what they've started doing. Censorship, which is what Google, Blizzard, on so on and so, censorship. You start impeding on people's freedoms. You can't do that, right? And Christians recognize, and this is why Christians, generally speaking, don't get or should not get involved with the political sphere, because you cannot change society top down. You can't do it. You can only change society bottom up. If the hearts and souls of the individual person on the street is not changed, then the problems in your society will never go away. Will never go away. And until such time as the hearts and minds of people are changed, you have no choice. If you're going to allow people their free will, you have no choice but to deal with the situation in the best way that you can. And it's just one of those things, man. You cannot get around it. Anyway, so let's now start getting stuck into the meat. Let's look at the verses. Let's look what it says. Try and be careful. Let's get the biblical. What was the mindset of these Jewish people that lived 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, whatever? What were they thinking? What was the culture like in this world, in the Middle East there, right? What was it like? So I've discussed the prima facie problem, right? The prima facie problem is people look at it, and this is what I think atheists are doing. It's a prima facie. I'm just imposing my prejudice onto this thing, and I know because I was an atheist. I did the same thing. So I'm not saying this because I'm trying to badger you or tell you that you're being awful person, whatever. But this is really what I think is going on. Right. Now, when we read the Bible, we need to... How many times does the word slave actually appear? And we notice that over time, if we look at the old Bibles, the word slave actually rarely ever appeared. It was the word servant, right? And this is important because the connotation is completely different. the connotation is totally different between servant and then outright slave. Completely different. And over time, as the ideology has become politicized, we've seen that more recent translations of the Bible, the word servant has been translated to slave more and more often. And why is this important? Because back in the day, right, in the times when the Bible was first being translated and written, there was no political incentive to either say so if we think about like the old Reformation Bibles and stuff like that, back before any of this transatlantic slave trade, before any of that, there was no political or overwhelming motivation for these people to import a bias into the text and make it slave or servant. They could just, they were free to just put down whatever was the most textually applicable, right? Just pure, just translate it like it was supposed to be, because the modern political mindset of clutching the pearls, slavery, didn't exist. They had no reason to fiddle with this concept in the Bible, right? And over time, as it's become more politically expedient and more of a political hot button, we find that modern day translations of Bibles have got like 160, almost 200 occurrences of the word slave, whereas in the 1611 Bible and stuff like that, there was only like 1 or 2, right? And this is significant. This is very significant. So let's go. So if we look here, the occurrence of slave, the word slave in the King James Bible. So the King James Bible, you're going back, the latest draft was the 1611. There were versions before it, if I'm not mistaken. Slave only occurred twice. However, the New King James is 46 times, the New International Version 130 times, the New Revised Standard Version 166 times. And it just gets completely ridiculous. Right, 135 times by 1985. So by the time the 20th century comes in, right? So this is the same Bible. This is the Jewish. This is actually a Jewish text, by the way. It was developed in Israel by I forget the name of the Bible. The Jewish something. Anyway. So back in 1917, only 3 occurrences, but by 1985, 135 times. This is significant, right? In the German languages, Sklav. By the way, people who think that slave is a racial thing, the word slave comes from the word Slav. Slavs were white people, okay? So the very word for slave was invented because the first people being enslaved by Europeans were white people, okay? So immediately puts to rest this idea that it's a whole racial thing. It's not. In the Luther Bible 1912, it didn't occur at all, right? In the German translations. Didn't occur at all. Whoops, sorry. Wrong one. Right? Luther Bible 1912, didn't, in the German languages, Sklav, didn't occur at all. Revised Luther Bible in 84:7 immediately. I mean, what's going on? The Elberfelde in 1993, 161. Sklavere plus sklavere 4 times, right? Which is the female version of the word. All right, sklav is male, is masculine. Sklavere is female, right? Here's the Spanish. Reina Valera. In 1909, only 4 occurrences. 1960, 25 occurrences. 1995, 65 occurrences of the word slave. So we see that there is this just strange proliferation over time. It's like, why is this word slave? Because you see, as the time goes on, the ideology is motivating a lot of these things. And also, what we find is that as the 20th century comes in, and the slavery has sort of started being abolished and all these kinds of things, as slavery's been abolished and all these kinds of things, and this rhetoric and it's now sort of widely accepted and stuff like that. And also you have the rise of what we call higher criticism, which is people who pretty much despise the Bible and have total utter bias towards the Bible, start getting their hands in to into biblical translation. So individuals like Westcott and Hort, who hated the Bible and made this quite plain. And when you read the letters that they wrote to each other, you actually see that there was no scholarly. And Westcott and Hort translations are heavily relied on in modern translations. And you see that the people, it was just crappy scholarship, right? Higher criticism was absolutely crap scholarship. Right, and you find that with the increase of higher criticism, because it was all the changes were ideologically motivated, right? All of them. Now, just as an overview, and we're going to see that I'm going to go to the verses, right? I'm sorry if this is very long. I'm going to go to the verses. We're going to see, right? When we look at the conditions of slavery, what was the conditions actually like, right? In the Old Testament, did slaves have holidays? Yes. Did the Roman slaves have holidays? No. In the New World, so this is America. Did slaves have holidays? Yes. All right. This was the conditions. In the Old Testament, did they have enough food? Yes. In Roman times, no. In the New World, no, they didn't have enough food. Legal redress. So did the slaves have legal representation? So in the Old Testament, you will often read, when you're reading the Bible, you hear that the judgment happened at the gate of the city, or that's where the elders sat, and it was a very, very public thing, right? So it's not like today where you go into a court, right? Into a court, and what happens inside the court you don't always know, because they can ban the media from reporting what's going on in court. In Israel, the judgment actually took place at the gates of the city, right? And so even the slaves had access to the elders and the judges at the gate of the city, where they were allowed to bring their cases to be heard if there was some injustice done, and then it could be judged in the view of everyone, and the laws were known by everyone, right? Everyone had to know the laws and the rules and the regulations. So the slaves or the servants, whatever you want to call it, they had legal redress in the Old Testament. In the Roman times, no, they didn't have. In the New World, they did not have. Sexual protection, they had sexual protection. Roman, New World, they did not have. Kidnapping, right? Were they allowed to be kidnapped? They were not allowed to be kidnapped in the Old Testament. Roman, yes. New World, yes. Were chains and stuff like that involved? Old Testament, no. Roman, yes. New World, yes. Were they allowed to be tortured? No, yes, yes. Physical abuse? No, yes, yes. And we're going to prove that. We're going to show. We're going to prove that, okay? Now, let's go to the sources. Let's go to the sources. So when we're dealing with the word slave, this is the word here, right? Strong's H5660, right? Ebed, that's the Hebrew word over there. This is all the details you need to know. The translations. The KJV translates this word in the following manner: servant, manservant, bondman, bondage, bondservant, on all sides, and so on. This is the many times, and you can go. I thoroughly recommend you go look at Strong's Concordance, because all of these instances, if you go open link in a new tab, right click, open link in new tab, you can go and see all the occurrences, and you can see the context in which they occur. So you have all of the outline of biblical usage. Slave, servant. There's actually not much difference. So in the Jewish society, the modern concept, so the modern you need to understand that today almost everyone has a liberal mindset, right? Classical liberal mindset, where there is this massive, overwhelming distinction between free and not free. Such concepts did not exist in the ancient world. In the ancient world, everyone, even the king, was a servant, was considered a servant. Even the king, right? And so this gives you a very, very different idea. Everyone. So in like a family, the children were, in a sense, would be considered servants of the father. This father would be considered masters of the children, and the children, being servants of the father, held certain responsibilities, and being the master of the children had certain responsibilities, including the wife, certain responsibilities, vice versa. And so, for example, if I am the master of the children or of the wife, or if they go out and commit a crime, I'm held responsible because I'm the master. And in the old days, property rights is not because we're actually dealing with people, so they treated women like property. the legal framework of property meant that if my property, if A, I did not manage my property correctly according to the law, and B, if my property or anything from my property, whether it is my animals or my servants or my family, if they went into the social arena and committed a crime or murdered someone, then I would be responsible, right? I would be brought in and I would be held accountable in some way for what happened. And I would have, so for example, let's say my child, right, and the Bible has it, let's say my child goes and commits a crime like murder, right? Let's say my child goes and murders someone. I would have to be, as the master of the house, I would have to be involved in executing judgment on my child. Okay? And people think this is absolutely terrible. How can this be? Think about it. How much more responsibility do you think parents would take of their children if they were responsible for executing the law, the consequences of the law on their children? Do you think parents would take more responsibility or less? Because what are the problems we have today? Parents do not take responsibility for their children. The children go out into the world, become delinquents, grow up as criminals, and they're just whisked away, end up in prison, they end up hurting other people, and the parents who were responsible for raising a good citizen, what happens to them? Nothing. Nothing. Right? So the children are not, in fact, so in the Old Testament mindset, in the biblical mindset, children were a liability. So if you're going to have children, you better make sure that you raise those children right, because your children are a liability. Today, however, what do we have? We have the reversal. Children are an asset. Okay? And what does that kind of mindset make? That kind of mindset means that you have single mothers living on welfare, pumping out children, not because they love their children, not because they care for their children or anything like that, but because the children means that they're going to receive money from the government. And who pays for that money? Those of us who are working are paying for the irresponsibility of other men and women, because the men now can go out and fornicate as much as they want and have as many children with as many women as they want and take no responsibility, and he gets off scot-free. He gets off scot-free, right? And he leaves the woman to fend for herself. And a lot of women have cotton on and said, okay, fine, I'll fend for myself, no problem. I'm going to get money from the government and I'm going to sit at home and I'm going to abuse my children because the children get abused. And this is the reality. Welfare state. In the Old Testament, you didn't have a welfare state. You didn't have social security, right? So if you became poor, you were screwed. Which is why in the Old Testament, you could sell yourself to someone and say, if you give me room and board and work and you look after me, I will give you my labor so that you can benefit from my labor. And and I can choose to either remain with the family permanently. So that's where a chattel situation, I can say, well, I'm going to sell you my labor forever until the day I die. Right? Fine, because I'm not interested in going out and doing things myself, right? If I've fallen on hard times, could be the case. Or I could say, or let's say I've got a debt, I could go pay off my debt, and once I've paid off my debt, I can then resume my normal life. And these are the kinds of sort of overlaps and kinds of things, right? So that's what we're dealing with there, right? These are the words. Slave, servant, manservant, a subject, servants, worshippers of God. So us as Christians, we call ourselves servants of God, right? Does that mean we're low down and miserable, and does that mean God can abuse us? No, it doesn't, right? Because even God abides by his own commandments, right? God will not break his own commandments, okay? Servant in a special sense as a prophet. So even the prophets and the Levites were considered servants, a servant of Israel, servants as a form of address between equals. So a lot of the time, when you look at the Bible, if you read the Bible through, when people address each other, they will say, your humble servant approaches you and stuff like that, is a form of respect and all that kind of stuff. I am in your service, because in the mindset of the olden day people, everyone was a servant. For example, we have a similar parallel would be modern day Japan, or even ancient Japan, where in Japan they have a very, very high social expectation of each and every individual, that you have that honor system where if you do something, you bring dishonor on your family, you bring dishonor on yourself. And so you are very, very much in the Japanese culture, you serve society and society serves you, and you are a servant to it, which is why they bow and all of these kinds of things. There is so it's a similar kind of mindset, that I serve you, and there is an honor attached to service, to being a servant. It's an honorable thing to submit yourself out of respect. It's the social way of being. Okay, it's actually quite an honorable thing, right? So if Japan, for example, is a similar, not precise, similar, right? So that's the situation there, right? So to understand the relationship between the servants and the master, we have many examples. So here's Abraham. He was the first. Abraham said, "Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, children, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir." Right? So explain to me where in the slavery of the American South would a slave, right, inherit the possessions of their master if their master didn't have children. Okay, so this is a completely different kind of relationship, right? And by the way, remember I said you have creation, fall, restoration. So Abraham was the first patriarch, right? Abraham was the first patriarch, and when you read the story of Abraham, you need to understand it as God is reintroduced, because by Abraham's time, people had basically forgotten about God, and were half worshipping him. So what we call syncretism, where you pay homage to more than one philosophical or religious system. And this is what Abraham was. Abraham was like a half pagan when he was still living at home. And so when the story of Abraham is basically God reintroducing himself to Abraham, because people had forgotten. And this is a process that takes like 80 something years. God doesn't just come in overwhelming power and say, and lay it all just right there. It's over a gradual period of time that God slowly introduces himself and develops a relationship with Abraham, which culminates right in the end, where God says to him, "Sacrifice your son Isaac." And the reason for that is because when Abraham was a pagan, human sacrifice and child sacrifice was common. And God, in this particular thing, he's testing Abraham to see, has Abraham caught on to the fact that I don't want child sacrifice yet? Right? That loyalty does not mean child sacrifice. So he tests him and says, "Can you sacrifice Isaac?" He goes and does it, and then right at the end God says, boom, Abraham, stop, don't do that. He's like, and the lesson there, and then God says, "I will provide a sacrifice myself." It's like, it's not up to you the way pagans do, right, to give the sacrifice. God's like, "I will give the sacrifice myself." So he's like, your faith is good, so you've understood correctly that I require faith in all things, but let me make it very clear, I don't want child sacrifice, because the one who is going to make the sacrifice is me. I'm the one that's going to make the sacrifice. And that story there is an allusion to Jesus Christ that eventually was going to come, and he was going to be that sacrifice. God himself was going to allow his son Jesus, who is also God, out of his own free will to sacrifice himself. So it's like, my people do not provide the sacrifice. I am the one that does that. And this is, so it's God is setting up his stall. This is who I am. And that sort of sets the tone for the rest of the development of the Israelite history. Okay? So we can see immediately that the situation between master and servant is totally different, because Abraham not having a child, the most loyal, the highest ranking servant in his household was going to inherit everything. Right? So this is not someone he's mistreating and beating up and whatever, right? Genesis 24. Abraham was old, stricken in age. The Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham had said to his eldest servant of his house, that ruled over all he had. Come on. This is a trustworthy person. Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. Right, now, in the Bible, when they put their hand under the thigh, this is not some perverted thing. The thigh, this is a symbolic thing. So if two men who obviously knew each other well, if I put so let's say myself and another Christian, I put my hand on the guy's thigh. The thigh is a symbol for the generative principles. So what he's saying here, if I put my hand on the thigh and I say, I vow to you, it means that vow does not only pertain to you, but pertains to your offspring and your children. So I'm making a vow to your whole family. And that's why they put their hand on each other's thigh. It's I'm making a vow to you and your children after you, that what I'm going to do, I will do for everyone, okay? So it's a very, very deep, very serious, very close, trusting. This is a close, trusting relationship. This is the closest relationship that the Bible allows two men to have, okay? Because homosexuality is obviously a problem. This is a very close relationship, okay? So, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and I will make thee swear by the Lord God of heaven. So they worship the same God, the God that thou shalt not take a wife. So he trusts this servant to choose a wife for his son. Massive responsibility. The level of trust here is unbelievable, okay? Absolutely massive responsibility. When Abraham heard his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. So, what you have here, the situation is Abraham migrated over to Canaan. He settled in Canaan, and he established very, very good relationship with the kings of the land. And what happens is, at some point, there was a war between 4 kings and 5 kings. There was a war between them. And Abraham, who was very well respected in the land, you can go back to Genesis and read the story. It's quite interesting. He was very well respected, and he realized that in this battle, that his son, his brother, the father of Lot, we eventually learn about Lot, had been taken captive. And so Abraham takes his servants, gives them weapons because they're trained. It says they're trained, and they go off and they join the kings that are fighting. I think he joined the 4 kings. He joined the smaller force, who was the righteous. They were the righteous people, and went off and defeated them and then brought them back. Now, please explain to me, right? Who in their right minds, if you think about the antebellum South, who would give their slaves weapons? Okay, this is a totally different, and train their slaves to fight. Right, it's unheard of in the modern conception of slavery. Doesn't exist. Doesn't you would, because they would imagine they had gone and given weapons to all the black slaves. The black slaves would have turned around and would have wiped them out, okay? Because they were being mistreated, and here, these people, Abraham had such a relationship to the people, the servants, the people who worked in his household, that they were like family, that they would put their lives on the line for each other, okay? It's a completely different relationship, master and servant, and that is why the appropriate translation is servant, not slave, in the sense that we see it today, right? Because again, if we go back to the concept of master and slave, each one comes with responsibility, and in the overall mindset, the master is also a servant, not only a servant of God, but a servant of the people who are under his protection and under his authority, because he is required by God to be a good master. It's a principle in the Bible we call stewardship. Stewardship means that every single thing that you have, if you're a Christian, everything that you have authority over, your body, the bodies of others, doesn't matter what it is, you have a responsibility of stewardship to maintain it, to look after it, to respect it, because in the philosophy of things, we are all servants to God, and ultimately everything belongs to God. Therefore, if I abuse someone else, I am not abusing my property, even if he's my servant. I am not abusing ultimately my property. I'm abusing God's property. That is the mindset of the people of Israel. That is where the mindset comes from, right? Because even the king is a servant ultimately, right? And in the Bible, right? In the Bible, a legitimate king is a king who also serves. And Jesus Christ, we call him the king, and there are 4 animals in the Bible that are used to depict Christ. One of them is the ox, and you've got 4 gospels, and each one of the gospels represents a different aspect of Christ. So the lion, the eagle, the man, and the ox. The ox represents a servant. So even Jesus Christ, one of the reasons why Christ's rulership or authority is legitimate is because Christ is not only God, he's not only king, but Christ is also servant, because he serves his people as well. And that, in the biblical mindset, is the only way that a king can be legitimate. The only way is if he serves his people as well, which is why God does that himself. Here's an interesting Egyptian example. So here's the story of Joseph, right? Here's the story of Joseph. Now, a backstory. I'm sorry if this is approached, but I need to give the backstory. Joseph was the son of Isaac, right? Jacob, sorry. Was the son of Jacob. Was the son of Jacob. Right? Yeah, Jacob, okay. There's a lot of family tree, let me tell you. And he had many sons and stuff like that, and his sons were jealous. His brothers were jealous of him. So Joseph was sold as a slave by his brothers to the Egyptians, and and he was mistreated, and he was thrown in prison and all these kinds of things. But through all the different confluences and stuff like that, Joseph ended up in a very, very high position within Pharaoh's kingdom. He became one of Pharaoh's top most trusted servants, and he put him, and so Joseph here becomes to the Pharaoh what Abraham's servant was to Abraham. He's got the same position, right? Highly trusted, had authority over everything, the whole land that was Pharaoh's. Joseph was given a vision by God, and in the vision he dreamt that there were 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows. And the translation of that video says, God said to him, listen, I'm warning you now, the next 7 years you are going to reap an extra harvest. So whatever you produce, you're going to be able to produce extra, like in abundance. But note that the 7 years that follow are going to be a severe famine. So with that in mind, everything that you make in surplus, make sure you store that away, implement all of these policies in Egypt to save all of that back, because when the famine hits, right, people are going to just start dying, and because other people are not planning for this, because other people don't have this foresight. And so Joseph goes to Pharaoh, and now Pharaoh really trusts him and says, listen, this is the dream I had. This was going to happen. And Pharaoh said to him, you go right ahead and save all of these things. And now what we're about to read is now the famine is taking place, and we see something very interesting happen. Joseph had placed his father and brethren bread according to the family. So now the famine meant that his father, because his father thought he was dead, okay? His father thought he was dead, but because of the famine, his family moved into Egypt, and that's how the Israelites got into Egypt in the first place. They moved from Canaan into Egypt, even though they had property and had been living in Canaan for many generations. They now moved to Egypt because there was still some prosperity in Egypt. And Joseph, they didn't know that Joseph was his son, but Joseph dealt with them and stuff like that. And there was no bread in the land, for the famine was very sore. so that the land of Egypt and all Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the corn which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into the Pharaoh's house. So this is that provisions that he made, okay? Because this was about to, because he knew the famine was going to hit. And when the money failed in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, and all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence? For the money faileth." So the money is running out. Our crops are failing. We can't sell the crops to get money and all these kinds of things. So because Joseph had reserves, he was able to distribute goods and things like that to the people. So why? Because the money faileth. Okay. And Joseph said, give your cattle, and I will give you for your cattle if money failed. So he said, give me your cattle, because the cattle were going to die, right? Because there's a famine. They couldn't produce. But he had. So he's like, well, there's no point in leaving the people because the cattle is going to die. Okay, because they have no means of feeding. But because we've stored, we can. So we make this trade here, and we give them stuff. And I will give you for your cattle if your money fail. And they bought their cattle to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange. So bread is a general term for food and whatever they require to sustain for their flocks, herds, asses, and he fed them with bread for all their cattle for that year. When the year had ended, they came unto him the second year and said unto him, "We will not hide it from my Lord," right? So this is that servant-master relationship happening here. This is with the Egyptians. These are not Hebrews. This is Egyptians, right? How that our money is spent. So here you notice that we will not hide it from my Lord. This is, whenever you see this in the ancient idea, when you present yourself as someone is your Lord and your servant, that appeal is an attempt to bring a closeness between you and the person you're appealing to. This isn't the typical idea that people have where, oh, you're a piece of dirt, and it's the person is saying, you are my Lord, I'm your servant, because they're trying to establish, it's a means of establishing a relationship. How our money is spent. My Lord also had the herds and candles. There is not aught left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our lands. Wherefore shall we die before thine eyes, both we and our land? So they'd lost, because the famine was terrible. Buy us and our land for bread. So what did they do? Freely, because they didn't have to do this, they weren't forced. Freely, because of the situation, said, buy us and our labor and our lands, so that you own it and you can manage everything, and we will rely on you and you will look after us. Because you must remember, there's no welfare state, there's no social security, there's no modern city and infrastructure, right? Famine, even in modern days, famine wreaks havoc, okay? So how much more so in those things? So people are having to deal. This is not an ideal situation, okay? Remember what I said earlier on. Regulation does not mean recommendation or condoning or that this is ideal. Regulation means a situation has arisen. It's not ideal. We have to deal with a situation, right? And this is the problem that, again, when atheists approach this subject, they always approach it in an idealistic way, which is simply, it's false. It's a fallacy. It's an idealistic way. It's actually a very childish way of assessing anything, that it must be all or nothing. There's actually a psychological term for it called splitting. It's what specifically people with personality disorder. I'm not saying you have a personality disorder and stuff like that, but it is recognized by all the literature, whether philosophical or psychological, that this all or nothing thinking is a fallacious way of thinking. It's a disordered way of thinking, right? And is the type of thinking that causes more injury than anything else, right? Like those examples I gave before of women losing their jobs and stuff like that because of feminist nonsense, okay? Let me just stretch this here. There we go, that's better. For the Egyptians sold every man, right, so, and not die and not be desolate. So they're making a trade here, free will trade and stuff. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For the Egyptians sold every man his field, because and so on and so forth. And as for the people, he removed them to the cities. So said, right, so because they're farmers and all, they were living in the rural areas, and so he said, come into the cities and I'm going to look after you. Remove them to the cities from one end of the borders of Egypt, even to the other end thereof. Only the land of the priests bought he not, for the priests had a portion assigned to them. So the priests always received a government stipend for them to sustain themselves, because the priests did not engage in any commercial work. Okay? Which, by the way, is a very, very good idea, because it prevents the clergy from becoming corrupt. Okay? If they and that's the problem with mega churches. Okay, so you want to know why a lot of Christianity gets corrupt these days? It's because many ministers and churches and people like that out there have ways and means of going into business and becoming very wealthy, and so then the religion becomes corrupt, right? So that's a problem. Then Joseph said unto the people, behold, I've brought you. So the Pharaoh gave, so they did not sell, the priests did not sell the land. I've brought you this day and your land for Pharaoh. Lo, here is seed for you, and ye shall sow the land. So he provided all of the means which they otherwise would not have had to cultivate the lands, to try and do something, because he had all of this stock, all of this reserve. And it shall come to pass in the increase that ye shall give the fifth part. So he says, so for this, there's a tax, right? So 1/5 and 4 parts shall be your own for seed of the field, and for your food, and for them of your household, and food for your little ones, right? So is this a slavery issue? Right? No, it's not a slavery issue. It's like they're basically still free for the most part. Right? This is greater freedom than suffering. This is greater freedom than suffering. Let me tell you something. I'm going to give you a bit of my own history. I come from Brazil, right? I was born in Rio de Janeiro, right? My family was not wealthy at all. They were very, very poor, especially my mother's side of the family. Very, very poor, right? And many of them still struggle till this day. And Rio de Janeiro is infamous throughout the whole world for the favela. Most people cannot imagine the kind of poverty that goes on in Brazil. You can't even begin to understand. And what do the people do? What recourse? They're free. They're free. But are they really? Because that poverty, they're enslaved to the poverty. All right? The condition of a human being is that we're going to be slaves to something. We're going to be servants to something. No matter what. The real life situation, we are going to be slaves or servants to something. We're always slaves of circumstance, as it were. Do you not think that most of these Brazilian people, if they were able to sell their labor to get housing, to get food, to get honest work, right, that they wouldn't do that? That if this system was in place, that they wouldn't do that? They would, in a heartbeat, they would take it. Any of us, if we were completely destitute, starving to the point where you have to chew on your toenails because you're so hungry, right? Because unlike the Western countries like the UK and the US, who are very wealthy, who can afford to have welfare and stuff like that, South America has no such thing. Africa has no such thing. China, Indonesia, all of these places, all of these third world countries, we've got no such thing. If you are poor, you're screwed. You die. That's the reality of the world. Okay? So when people approach, and this is one of the reasons why I get rather pissed off with people, because they come with their idea, it's like, you know what? Shut up. Okay? Because most of the people objecting to most of these things, especially these activists and stuff like that, right? It's like you are all middle-class people with full bellies and a house and a roof to live under. Safe. You don't have to worry about crime, drive-by shootings, gangs. Let me tell you, you go to the favela in South America, gangs left, right, and center. Some of my family members, when they go to so here's something that people do in Brazil. They carry 2 wallets. One wallet is for themselves for the day. The other wallet is for the thieves. Right? So you put a little bit of something in the wallet, whatever, right? So that when you give it to the thief, he thinks you've given him his real wallet, so that he doesn't shoot you for your real wallet. And so that by giving that, you don't lose everything. That's the situation in some places there. Life is absolutely miserable. People getting shot. Just, life is worth nothing there. Do you not think that this kind of situation, right? You work, I will buy your labor, right? I will sell you myself as a laborer, right? And I will enter into this government program, right? And I keep, I keep 4/5 of everything I produce, and I give come on, right? I won't own the land, I won't own the whatever, but whatever I accumulate, I can use. I keep 4/5 of my production, I keep for myself. Come on, right? You've got to be so narrow-minded to think that what's going on in the Bible, or narrow-minded, because I don't want to impute the goodwill. I want to try and treat this in goodwill, but it is narrow-minded or shallow thinking or ignorance and stuff like, to think that what's in the Bible represents what was going on in the antebellum South. It's not the same thing, right? And it's because most of the people making these arguments, I have never seen a poor person make this argument. It's always middle-class people, middle-class Westerners that make these arguments, middle-class Western atheists that make these arguments, right? That, for the most part, don't know what it's like. I mean, I'm not saying I know your life or anything like that. Please don't get me wrong, right? But because obviously it might be the case. Maybe you know what it's like to suffer. Who knows? I mean, nowadays, who doesn't know what it's like to suffer? I mean, I do. I've been through some rough things, man. But most of the time, and this is the problem that makes this issue beyond the reach of understanding, is because Christians and atheists both are guilty, right? So let's be fair, both are guilty. The atheists are overly precious, pearl clutching, right? Slavery, you know, because it's rhetorically expedient. And the Christians as well, oh no, the Bible is absolutely perfect. Nothing ever went wrong in the Bible. Again, because it's rhetorically expedient, right? And so the Christians misrepresent and the atheists misrepresent, and both are wrong. Both are utterly wrong. All right? And so you understand that it's the character of God that he's merciful if he says, rather than force and impose, I am going to accommodate certain things because the circumstance calls for it, because my kingdom is based on a foundation of free will, and so I will not change, I will not do anything if it means that I have to exercise overwhelming authority or power and circumvent people's free will in order to get what I want to happen. That is not what a just God does. And a just God, a merciful God, says, even though these people have ignored me and are suffering in their own misery and stupidity, I am still going to take this bad situation and try to make the best of it. That's a merciful God, because what should, by rights, what should he do? He says, you chose this, so you suffer, right? He could do that, right? It's like, you guys, you want to go and commit crime. You want to go and take drugs. You want to go and eat unhealthily. You want to go and be mean and treat each other badly and be racist and have prejudice and be bigoted and do and disrespect your parents. You know, disrespect the marriage institution. Be greedy, like the corporations and all. Be greedy. It's like, you people are doing this yourselves, right? And God could just leave us to it, because we said we want to be free, right? But he still makes a way. Still makes a way. And look what the servants say. And they said, thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in the sight of my Lord, and we will be the Pharaoh's servants. And Joseph made it law over the land of Egypt unto this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th part, except the land of the priests only, which became not the Pharaoh's. And Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. So everyone benefited. The Israelites benefited, the Egyptians benefited, everyone benefited, right? So God doesn't, as much as he possibly can, this is the point. This is the point. As much as he possibly can, he doesn't only look after his own people. And this is a salient point because it's going to come up later. He tries to look after the other nations as well, which is why he allows, when you get to Leviticus, he says, you may buy people from other civilizations and bring them in to this economic situation, because what is happening here is better than what's happening out there. So rather than put up the borders and say, you people, screw the other people, they can suffer, he says, no, they are allowed. And you will see the Bible talk about sojourners, people who come into Israel from other lands to live amongst the people for various reasons. Right. By the way, here's a nice interesting article. Egyptologist. The life of slaves in Egypt was not as hard as we think. I'll put the link below. Right? Not as rough as we think. Again, most of our thinking when we think about slavery, servitude, all this kind of stuff is there's actually in philosophy and in logic, you actually have something that's called poisoning the well. Our way of thinking, the well has been poisoned because when we think about stuff that happened before the slave trade of the 18th century, 19th century, right? Before all of that, right? Everything that happened before, we view through the lens of what happened afterwards, exclusively, right? We use our modern knowledge, our modern bias, our modern understanding, and we take that, we throw it into the past, and we impose that on other civilizations when they had a completely different way of thinking about things, and we ignore all of it, right? And everyone does this. Everyone, Christians, atheists, everyone does this, right? Which is one of the reasons why Christians are so ignorant about what they believe a lot of times and misrepresent what they believe a lot of times, right? Here's another thing here. This is Job, another situation. For it is a fire that consumeth to destruction and would root out all my increase. So Job is saying that this destruction can come upon me and eliminate everything that I've accumulated if I do anything wrong. Okay? If I despise the cause of my manservant or my maidservant when they contend with me. So these things, these awful things, let it happen to me if I mistreat those who are under my authority, my manservant, my maidservant, my slave, whatever you want to call it, right? And I don't listen to them when they contend with me and say, listen, what you're doing, you're not treating me well. And he says here, what is the comment? What then shall I do when God riseth up and when he visiteth? What shall I answer him? What shall I say to God? So here we understand that the Hebrew mindset, the ethic is in every single thing that I do, no matter who I'm doing it with, whether it is a free person or a bondservant or anyone, in the way I deal with that person, I have to deal with them, bearing in mind that one day I'm going to answer to God for everything that I've done. Here it is, did not he that made me in the womb make him also? So God formed me in the womb, not only me in the womb, but the slave as well. We're equal in the eyes of the Lord, right? We're equal. So can you now understand why this, let me change. Do you understand now why the slave Bible had to be so heavily edited? Okay, so heavily edited. Because of this, right? It gives context. If I have withheld from the poor their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or I have eaten my morsel myself alone, and the fatherless hath not eaten thereof. For from my youth he was brought up with me, as with a father, and I have guided her from my mother's womb. So here he's talking about that the children of the servants, he grew up alongside, side by side with the servants in the household, right? He grew up with them. He knows them. They're lifelong together, right? In the family, because families were massive, extended families. It was not only blood family, the servants were treated like family as well. I mean, you see many times in other places in the Bible where if a servant died, where the whole family would gather together and mourn over them, right? And erect a memorial to the servant, right? If the servant, if servant passed away for whatever reason, for old age or whatever, you see that in the Bible, okay? If I have seen any perish for want of clothing, or any poor without covering, if his loins have not blessed me, and if he were not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the fatherless when I saw my help in the gate. Here's the gate again, the judgment, where in the law, in the judgment, where I had an opportunity to help people and I didn't. Then let my arm fall from my shoulder blade and my arm be broken from the bone. Does this sound like people who are hell-bent on abusing and beating the crap out of slaves? No. Right? The whole Bible has to be taken into context. The whole ethic, the whole culture has to be taken into context. Does God make exceptions? Let's go see some example. Here, Malachi. For the Lord, the God of Israel, saith that he hateth putting away, for one covereth violence with his garment, said the Lord of hosts. Wherefore, take heed to your spirit, that ye deal not treacherously. Right. Covereth violence. So, if you know that your neighbor is abusing his servants, you have an obligation to report him. Like Job was saying, to judgment at the gate, you have the obligation, you are obligated. Go to the gate, listen, this man is mistreating his slaves. He's mistreating his servants, whatever you want to call it, right? The Lord hates this. He hateth putting away, for one covering violence with his garment, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore take heed your spirit, that ye deal not treacherously with anyone. Mark. This is salient, right? This is a salient point. What did Moses command you? And they said, Moses suffered to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away. And Jesus answered, said to them, why did God allow divorce? For the hardness of your heart, he wrote to you this precept. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his wife and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh, so that they are no more twain but one flesh. Therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Right, so here we see God is making a concession. God's ideal was what? Divorce should never happen. But because of the hardness and the stupidity of your hearts, because you abuse each other, because you have awful relationships, because you go off on flings and marry a person you've known for 2 weeks and end up that the person is absolutely miserable or a psychopath or whatever, what does God say? Is God going to say, no, this is my law? Or is God going to say, you know what, even though it is not my preference for you to divorce, I'm going to have mercy on you, and I'm going to realize that the fact of the matter is that some men beat their wives, some women beat their husbands, some parents abuse their children, and so on and so forth. Therefore, and that there is marital unfaithfulness, right? Marital unfaithfulness in all its forms. And so for that reason, I am going to conditionally allow divorce to happen. Not God's preference. He's saying, I don't want this. But being merciful, I'm going to allow it, but it's going to be regulated. You are only allowed to divorce under X, Y, and Z conditions. It's the same thing he's doing with slavery, by the way. We're going to see. Right? It's not ideal, but I have to regulate it because, why? Because people are sinful and people are evil and people mistreat each other. And the only way that God can stop that happening across the board is if he exercises an overwhelming force or overwhelming power in order to subjugate people and remove their free will from them. It's the only way God can do that. Okay, so trying to preserve people's free will. So it's a difficult situation, right? We put God in a very, very difficult situation all the time, right? So here we have one of the controversial verses, Exodus 21 verse 12, and it says here, so the controversial verse says here is this one here, is these two verses. And if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. Other translations say property. Now, most atheists will read this. For example, Sam Harris will read this and say, oh, this means that they can beat the shit out of their people and no problem. Right. Now, after everything I've just said, do you think that is a legitimate way? Really, really, really honestly, do you think that's a legitimate way of seeing it? Right? Because this is one of the favorite texts that atheists bring out. Oh, but because he's his property, you know. Let's get some context, right? Because they will ignore the verses that come before and the verses that come after. Right? Let's go to the verses that come before. It says here, let's go to here. He that smiteth a man so that he die shall be surely put to death. Right? So this is, thou shalt not murder, yeah? And if a man lie in wait, but God deliver him unto hand, then so appoint thee a place. So that's a bit difficult. That's for, so if you've hurt someone or killed someone, you were allowed. So let's say I killed your brother by accident. And you. So here's what that verse. Let me clear it up, because I can already see people are gonna take exception. So let's say I through some sort of negligent behavior, I killed someone by accident. Let's say I'm working on a construction site and I drop a brick by accident, lands on someone's head. Their family would be allowed to exact revenge on me, right, and kill me. But I was allowed to escape to a sanctuary city where their family would not be allowed to pursue me, right? But that's if it was an accident, okay? So that's what it's saying. That's what it's saying here. If a man lieth not in wait, so you're not going out and purposefully trying to murder him, but God deliver him unto his hand. So if I don't go to a sanctuary city, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee, and sort of. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take from him mine altar, that he may die. Okay? A man that smite his father or his mother shall be put to death. Here we go. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. So, according to this verse, are you allowed to go raiding villages to get slaves and steal them and abduct them? No. Because this forms part of the law. You're not allowed to. If you do it, death penalty. Right? Please show me where this was allowed in antebellum South. Doesn't exist. Right? This is what comes before. This is all part of the jurisprudence. We're now dealing with biblical jurisprudence. It's explaining. Right? So judges are going to look at this and try to assess, because you need to understand when you talk to a judge that these things are different, are difficult to judge. To judge people's intent, because intent matters. He that curseth father or mother shall be put to death. Here's salient. If men strive together, and one smite another with a stone or with his fist, and he die not, but keepeth his bed. If he rise again and walk abroad upon his staff, then shall he that smote him be quit. So he is not in danger of punishment, death penalty, only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. Right? So what he's saying over here, that sometimes people get into altercations, and if the person survives, and then you are this is the jurisprudence. The judge, what God is saying is like, it then assume within the judicial thing, assume that the guy did not intend to kill him. Assume that this situation, that, you know, tempers flared and whatever, and they got into fisticuffs and stuff like that. So rather than persecuting the guy and bringing the law upon him, all he has to do is, because that guy now was bedridden for 3 or 4 days, let's say, that would represent a loss of wages, right? So the guy that harmed him would have to pay his wages and have to pay all of his medical bills, right? Because it says here, and this is important, right? Only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. So the loss of time, this is an unspecified amount, because this would depend on how much money the guy would have otherwise been able to earn were he working, okay? Now here is a slightly different situation. And if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. So if a servant is killed, punished, it's death, okay? Death. So immediately you can see this is not an abusive, no abuse is allowed. Notwithstanding, however, this is now the same. If he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. Now here's the difference, right? The other man, he would have to pay him money because he would lose out on work, right? On being able to go to work. But in the situation of a slave, the one who's losing out on the labor is the master who has the slave or the servant. So rather than pay the slave or the servant money for time lost, because essentially he himself has lost money because his slave or his servant is not working, right? So that financial cost has already been incurred by the master, right? And so they are saying to him, so assume, because the master has a financial investment hanging on this individual's labor, right? Because we need to understand something. Even in the antebellum South, well, you need to understand, slaves were bloody expensive. A slave in the antebellum South in those days cost as much as a mid-range car today. Okay? Now, no one goes and purposefully, unless they're really malicious, really like out of hand, totally mad in it. No one goes and destroys something that they've made such an investment in, even if the person is a slave, right? And so the assumption is, if he injured him, he's already incurred the cost at the loss of the guy's labor. He's already incurred the cost of having to pay for his medical bills, and obviously he's paying for his medical bills because as the master, he is responsible for everyone under his house, for food, for shelter, for medical bills, for everything, because this individual has sold himself, has sold his labor to the master, right? So this guy's already incurred all the financial costs. So the financial costs here that apply to someone that is not under his authority, that would be given to that person, those costs already occurred, so he doesn't incur that punishment. So there's a slightly different situation here. So for here's his money, it says, because, so this is the jurisprudence. So here is a clause for here's his money. So it's a because clause, right? That is the judge is being told, assume in this situation that this was not done on purpose, that tempers flared, they got fight, because remember Job was saying that servants contend with their masters as well. So servants were free to speak out and say things, and fights could happen. Obviously that's what people are like. He shall not be punished. And here's a clause, here's the reason why, for here's his money, because there's an investment. He's already lost money in his investment because he's not working, lost money because he has to pay for his medical bills and all that sort of thing, and so on and so forth. And it goes on, it says, if men strive, right? So this four clause, remember this, okay? We're going to get back to that. If men strive, hurt a woman with child and her fruit depart, and pay as the judges determine, minister far, give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, and so on. If a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. If he smite his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go 3. And now here's the language, right? It says here, it doesn't say he will let him go free. It says he shall let him go free. This is you have no choice. Okay? So the idea that they were allowed to beat the crap out of their servants is rubbish. The law says if you injure your servant in any way, you, by law, because why? Because the servant has access to the gate and all these kinds of things, and other people were obliged by law to not cover up violent crime, as we saw in previous verses. You are not allowed to cover up any violence whatsoever. You had to report it to the elders and the judges at the gate. So the slaves, the servants, everyone had access to the gate in that judgment, and any injury goes free. The person goes free. End of story. You shall, right? And this is where people need to understand language. There is a difference between you will or you shall. Shall is a definite, you've got no choice. You have to do it. Okay? And furthermore, let's see here, when we're talking about property, how a person is responsible. If an ox gore a man or woman that they die, the ox shall be stoned and his flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be quit. Right? So I've got an ox, my ox kills someone. Right, I lose the ox. Right, the ox must be killed. I have no rights to that ox. The ox must be killed, and the flesh is not. So it's not like I'm not allowed to. My ox died. But some people be, or at least I benefit because I can get the meat. You are not allowed to get the meat. Nothing. You are not allowed to benefit from this ox whatsoever. Okay. His flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be quit. So the owner is not responsible because, why? Because it could have been an accident, okay? But if the ox were wont to push with his horn in time past, and it hath been testified to his owner. So if the ox had a habit of doing this, and the owner knew, and it says here, and he hath kept him not, so the owner was negligent, knew the ox was violent, and had a habit of attacking people, and knew, and the ox kills a woman, then not only the ox will be put to death, but the owner will also be put to death. Right? So this is what property rights in the Bible means. That, so in this case, if my ox goes and kills someone, and I've been warned before, listen, your ox is aggressive, this and this and this, I've been warned, and I've done no preventative measures to prevent harm coming from people, then the ox, because the ox is my property, then I will be killed if my ox or my horse or whatever, or my dog or my family members or anyone like that goes out and injures another person or kills another person. Not only does the ox get killed or the horse or the dog or whatever, but I suffer punishment as well, because they're my property. I am responsible. Okay? And that is how property rights work. It's who is responsible. Property rights is not I can do whatever the hell I want. Property rights in those days, it's not like modern day. Modern day, it's all about rights. It's this rights stupidity. Everyone has the right to do this and this and that. This freedom, liberal freedom is stupidity, right? In those days, it's about who is responsible. Who is liable, right? Do you own this thing over here, sir? Yes, you do. Why did you not handle it correctly? Is your wife destitute, whatever, your family member say, why aren't you looking after them? What are you doing here? To the gate, to the judges with you, right? So they can decide your fate. So this is very fair. This is very fair. And his owner shall be put to death. If there be laid on him a sum of money, then he shall give for the ransom of his life whatsoever is laid upon him. So let's say it was my brother that got killed by the ox. I have the choice of doing one of two things. I can either call for the death of the person who owns the ox, or I can say to him, listen, I can be merciful on you. I'm not going to call for your death, but you have to pay me a ransom for the life that was taken. Okay? So there's that option. Whether he have gored a son or gored a daughter, according to his judgment, shall be done unto them. If the ox shall push a manservant or maidservant, he shall give unto their master 30 shekels of silver. The ox shall be stoned. And if the man shall open a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, or an ox. So this is basically what happens. So the ox, so even though it talks about it, it's not just to an ox. This is basically setting out the jurisprudence. What happens if someone else is injured because of something you have done, or your property gets injured in your property? This is basically setting out liability laws. Who is liable for what? Okay, so now let's go back quickly to the thing, to this for clause here, for here. So we have here for, he is his money. Do we have another example? We have here Deuteronomy. There's a for clause here as well. This is also law. But if a man find a betrothed damsel in the field, and the man force her and lie, so if he rapes her, then the man only that lay with her shall die. But unto the damsel thou shalt do nothing. There is in the damsel no sin worthy of death, for as when a man riseth against his neighbor. So here's the for clause. Why is she not guilty? For as when a man riseth against his neighbor and slayeth him, even so is this matter. For he found her in the field, and the betrothed damsel cried, and there was none to save her. So what is it saying? It's saying that if a damsel is out in the field and she is set upon, and she cries for help, and there's no way, and she's raped, the man will be put to death. So in this situation, the man's testimony and the woman's testimony are not counted as equal. The woman's testimony is worth more than the man's testimony. Okay, so is this very progressive by any chance? Right? The woman's testimony counts for more than that of the man. He says because the man has the strength to overpower, and the man should not have been there in the first place. In the ancient Israelite, if you're a man and you see other, it's like, if that woman is not your wife, or is not your children or your sister, you've got no business doing anything with her. Right? And if you go and you screw around with her, you might lose your life. Okay? So don't go mess with her. Now, ladies and gentlemen, can you imagine if this law, this is even more progressive than modern laws, because as far as I'm concerned, rape should carry the death penalty. Rape should carry the death penalty. Can you imagine if rape carried the death penalty? And if false rape accusations carry the death penalty? Do you think that the whole situation in modern day would change? How many innocent men go to prison because of false rape accusations? And moreover, the only reason why the men can be falsely accused of rape is because these men were stupid enough to put themselves in a situation where there were no witnesses. Right? Where there were no witnesses, so that the woman could lie about it. And likewise, you know, if these things had this heavy penalty, I can assure you that if this was brought about today, that the whole rape culture and all that stupidity that goes on, it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. The reason why we have the social justice nonsense going on in campus today, with men and women unable to understand with each other, is precisely because men and women, throughout all of the Christian cultural laws that governed the relationship and their interactions between men and women, threw that out, and what has happened? Nothing but evil has resulted. Women being abused by men, men being abused by women, men and women no longer understand each other, men and women constantly fighting with each other. All hell breaks loose. It's that simple. It's that simple, right? So in this verse, here it is. Here's the jurisprudence, right? Worthy of death. Here's the for clause. For, because. So this is the consideration. This is the jurisprudence. It's the judge, when he's seeing the situation, God is telling him, in this matter, assume that X and Y and Z is true. And it's the same thing here. For, here's his money. In this situation, assume that because the individual has invested so much money, because it wasn't cheap, invested so much money in the slave, or this servant, whatever you want to call it, assume that in this situation that he didn't mean to do this, to actually do this, right? But because he has harmed him, so because he has harmed him, smite the eye, so that he's hospitalized, smite the eye tooth, whatever the case might be, because of this situation, right? So even though it says, assume that he didn't mean to harm him or kill him, therefore, so this is dealing with the death penalty. Don't give him the death penalty, because we're going to assume that because he's invested in him, that he didn't mean to kill the guy. But because of the other laws, you are not allowed to harm the eye or the tooth or whatever the case might be. The servant has the right, by law, if he wants to, obviously. The master is obliged by law, legally mandated, to let him go. No choice but to let him go. Okay? So this is, yeah, now let's look at some other things before I get to Leviticus. Right, I want to talk about the following here. Sorry, that's the wrong one. So when we talk about runaways, okay, this is very important. We need to talk about runaway. When slaves or servants or whatever you want to call it, I don't care. I'm interested in the principle of the matter, right? So let's go back. So we have seen established all of these things. They had holidays, they had food, legal redress, sexual protection. They were not allowed to be kidnapped. No chains, no torture, no physical abuse. In the Romans, none of the protections, all of the abuses. In the New World, only one benefit, none of the legal protections, and all of their abuse, right? So anyone, so you can understand here that anyone so when you argue, and this is one thing I have to make clear, anyone who says, oh, but the Christians used the Bible to substantiate slavery, that means only one thing. One thing only. That statement has no relevance whatsoever, right? It's like saying, because someone ran around with a cake, shoving it down people's throats, and so that they choke, therefore we must ban cake. That is literally how idiotic that statement is. It's irrelevant as to whether or not cake is actually legal or should be allowed. It's the same thing. Some Christians use the Bible in order to substantiate slavery, right? Irrelevant. The only thing that tells you is that those Christians were retarded or idiotic and knew absolutely nothing about the Bible. Nothing. That they were arguing, they were imposing their ideology onto the Bible, just like atheists do. They were imposing their own ideology onto the Bible, rather than reading the Bible properly and performing proper exegesis. Okay? That's the only thing it tells you. It's the only thing it tells you. Right? So the argument is irrelevant. The fact that anyone used the Bible, if I walk around the streets with a big Bible, old Bible, and I beat people over the head with it, oh, look at this, he's used the Bible to beat people. It does not mean that the Bible must now be considered a dangerous weapon and must now be regulated, okay? Or books in general. No, okay? All it means is that I'm cooked in the head and I should probably be locked up, okay? And here's the thing. A salient point. Whenever people say, oh, the Bible was used by some people to support slavery. Yeah, okay, fair enough. But guess what, ladies and gentlemen? The Bible was also used for abolition. Right? So the Bible was used both for slavery and for abolition. But, most importantly, which one managed to sustain the argument biblically so that their position won out in the end? The abolitionists, not the slavers. Because today, what do we have? Abolition. Hello? So what does the historical context do? It says, even though people tried to use the Bible to substantiate slavery, they were ultimately unsuccessful and unable to substantiate the position of slavery from Scripture, so that the people who wanted to abolish the slavery by using the Scripture were the ones that had the greater weight of evidence scripturally. Therefore, their ideology was the one that passed, and abolition became the norm in the whole world. So there's no argument there. No argument whatsoever. And we could, and if this argument is meant to work, we could say the same thing. Evolution caused Hitler to do scientific experiments on the Nazis, for example, right? Every atheist on the planet would object to that, obviously, right? Because evolution, the theory of evolution, does not make it necessary that you practice eugenics, does not make it necessary that you see blacks as inferior. By the way, the theory of evolution was used by slave people who were pro-slavery to say that blacks were less than human. Right? Blacks were put in cages at the zoo. This was done by secular people. By the way, this was a secular philosophy because Christians rejected evolution. Okay? So are we going to say now that secular ideology based on evolution is now racist and we must get rid of it? We must get rid of evolution because people used it to lock black people in cages with monkeys? No. Would be idiotic. So if it's not legitimate to do it with the theory of evolution, it's not legitimate to do it with the fact that some Christians used it to. It's dishonest. It's double standard. Okay, double standard of the highest order. Right. So let's continue. Runaways. Here was the law in the Bible: you shall not give up. Shall not, again, remember, it's a definite clause. It's obligation. Shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose, within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. He's utterly free to do what he wants. You shall not give him to his master. Antebellum, South USA, failure to deliver back escaped slave, if you do not deliver an escaped slave back to his master, you would get 6 months prison and a fine of $1,000. And let me tell you, in those days, $1,000 was an absolute fortune. Absolute fortune. You had every reason to take a runaway slave back to his master. Failure to do so, and you'd end up in prison and with a fine of $1,000. Absolute fortune. Okay? And the Bible, you shall not. Shall not. And by the way, the gentleman that was objecting says, oh well, you know, some of the Jewish people could have locked their slaves up. And it's like, I don't care what the individuals might have done anecdotally. The fact of the matter is, according to the law which God established, they were not allowed to do that. Therefore, the character of God is vindicated, and the fact that Christians can only operate, Jews could only operate in a malicious way contrary to the law. Therefore, it was not a testament of God's character. It is a testament of the character of the Jewish individual who abused and imprisoned his slave. Has nothing to do with God. Therefore, God's character remains vindicated. Okay? South Carolina law, 1740. And it shall be further enacted, the authority of the foresaid, that if any slave who shall be brought out of the house or plantation where such slave shall live, or shall be usually employed, or without some whiter person in company with such slave, shall refuse to submit or undergo the examination of any white person, it shall be lawful for any such white person to pursue, apprehend, and moderately correct such slave. And if any, that's just ridiculous, moderately correct. And if any such slave shall assault and strike such a white person, such a slave may be lawfully killed. You find no such thing in the Bible. The law code of Hammurabi: if anyone find runaway male or female slaves open country and bring them to their masters. See how even in other cultures they use the title open country, right? Out in the open country, right? You see this open country language being used in the Bible a lot as well, right? It's all part of the same cultural milieu. The master of the slave shall pay him 2 shekels of silver, right? Every incentive to bring a slave back. Every single incentive to bring a slave back. Runaway slaves? No. Right. Let's go to now Leviticus. Where is the one that people have a problem with? Go to Leviticus 44. Right. Thy bondservants and thy bondmaid, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are around you. Of them shall ye buy servants and maids. Right. So, now that we have a little bit of context, it says here, now the word here, shall, is in italics, which means it's not in the original. Okay? So, if we remove that and we say, thy bondservants and thy bondmaid, which thou shalt have, be, so, of the heathen that are around you, of them shall ye buy servants and maids. So, you were not allowed, as an Israelite, there was a distinction between an Israelite and a person of a foreign nation. All right? So, again, we see from the previous context, if an Israelite offers himself to you and says, please buy me, purchase me, and I will go into servitude, a fellow Israelite was not allowed to accept that. Okay? He was only allowed to do that if it was a foreign individual. And there's a very, very complicated cultural reason for that. When Israel moved into Canaan, established themselves and all that kind of stuff, each and every single one of the tribes received an inheritance of land. Everyone had an inheritance of land. Each tribe, each individual, you had your piece of land, and on that land was your inheritance. It would pass from you to your father, to your children, to your grandchildren, and would stay in your family as an inheritance. Okay, as an inheritance. Therefore, everyone, if someone lost their land for whatever reason, right, or fell into a destitute situation, there was a philosophy within Jewish culture called a kinsman redeemer, because it's within Israel, and that's where your family is. In order to prevent Israelites from taking advantage of other Israelites that had lost everything, by law, if that Israelite for debt or whatever lost their land or whatever the case might be, a kinsman, another of their family, of their tribe, would redeem that, would buy out that land and sort of re-establish them, right? But because because foreigners didn't have that same thing, there was no option. They didn't have kinsman redeemers, so the only option left to them was to sell themselves as a servant, to sell their labor, right? Whether temporarily or perpetually, whatever the case might be. That was in Israel, because it's not their homeland. They had no other choice. That was the only way. So whilst God prevented that for the Israelites, because then the Israelites could abuse each other in that sense, right? He allowed it conditionally, not because he condones it. He allowed it for the foreigners because there was no other option. There were no kinsman redeemers for the foreigners, right? And that's what you actually, why this distinction is made, right? And again, because they had no kinsman redeemers, right? Moreover, of the children of the strangers that are sojourners among you, among them shall ye buy, and of their families that with you. So you were to take everyone in, the whole family and everything, and look after them, right? Which they begat in your lands. These shall be your possession. So again, these will be your responsibility, right? It's your responsibility, and your responsibility perpetually. So it's not like, what if you die, they can be sold off to whatever the case might be. It is now, these people are now your family's responsibility perpetually, right? Unless there was some violence or whatever the case might be, they could be let go as per the other laws, right? The other laws would apply if there was any abuse and stuff like that. But essentially, if you do take someone in, you are to take in his family, his children, and they will become part of your family. Basically, like it was with Abraham, where if Abraham died and he had no children, then the servant would inherit. So in this situation, according to those previous clauses, right, as an inheritance for your children after you, if you did not have children, then your servant would then inherit and carry on your name. All right? Ye shall use their labors forever, but over and forever here is just perpetually, not permanently, like no matter what, like because the other laws still applied. If you abuse them, whatever, they could go free and etc., pay money and whatever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one over another with cruelly. So you are not going to use, so God is rule over another cruelly. So God is preventing the Israelites the similar sort of thing, in order so that between themselves they did not try take advantage. So for example, so there's an example. So for example, there's a king Ahab where his wife Jezebel killed Naboth in order to gain access to his land and all that kind of stuff. So it prevented economic mischief from happening between the Israelites themselves, because they wanted each other's land and all that kind. So that was removed. That possibility was removed from the Israelites. If a sojourner or stranger dwelling by thee get riches, and thy brother by him be impoverished, and sell himself to the stranger or sojourner dwelling by thee, or to the stock of the stranger's family. So here in this sense, the stranger, so he's a non-Israelite, is rich and he has his own land and his own property, and one of your brethren who's impoverished sells himself to the stranger or sojourner dwelling by thee. He says, after that he has sold, he may be brought out. You can go and buy him. So again, this is that kinsman. You may redeem your brother from him, because then this also prevents the sojourners, the strangers who might have sort of anti-Israelite sentiments. It prevents them from abusing and engaging in the similar type of economic intrigue that God was trying to prevent the Israelites from engaging in as well. Or his own, and buy him out, and so on and so forth. Then the rest is just all details, a jubilee and all, be free and all that kind of stuff. So we have here inheritance, right? We talk about inheritance. Let's see if I think there might have been some other. No usury, fear thy God. So this is always under God, sort of thing. All right, so let's go here. When we talk about inheritance, right, as inheritance for your children, well, how do we understand this concept of inheritance? Here we go. Inheritance is a serious thing. And it came to pass that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard, which was in Jezreel, hard by the place of Ahab king of Samaria. And Ahab spoke unto Naboth, saying, give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near unto my house, and I will give thee for it better vineyard than it. Or if it seems good to thee, I will give thee the worth of it in money. And Naboth said to her, here's what the Lord forbid me that I should give the inheritance of my fathers to thee. Right? So when it says here, the inheritance, your property, everything is an inheritance, and God forbid that you give them to other people, because those people might mistreat, those people might not look after this inheritance in the way that you would. Okay? Because as an inheritance, you have an obligation to God and your ancestors to look after that inheritance. And Naboth came into his house heavy and displeased because of the word. So not even the king was allowed to receive, to demand someone's inheritance for them, right? So this prevented abuse by the political class as well, okay? Your inheritance, property rights, no one's allowed to touch it, okay? And property rights gave significant protection to anyone who was considered property in a legal sense, under the protection, under the authority of a specific master. It gave significant protection. Right? And Jezebel then spoke and said unto him, and Jezebel does now not govern the kingdom of Israel. So it's Jezebel's attitude that because he's king, he should be able to do what he wants. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them, and sent it to the elders and nobles, and she wrote proclaimer for Anyway, so the story ends up that Jezebel eventually has him killed. So this is how serious and the kind of protections that things allow under the concept of an inheritance, the protections for not only the property but the people, the children, the wives, everyone, the servants, everyone that is under the authority of the patriarch of the house, right? So it shows you the enormous responsibility that the patriarch of a house had. The responsibility was absolutely enormous, because not only was his massive responsibility, he was liable even on pain of death in many cases, if there was abuse or if there were any problems. It was really it was a very serious issue being a patriarch of a house. It was a massive responsibility. You cannot imagine, and it's something that men today don't understand, what it means to be the man of the house. Men today spit on the responsibility of what it means to be an authority and being the man of the house. Men abuse the situation. And why do men abuse the situation? Is because the responsibilities that were in place in the old days no longer apply today. Right? No longer apply today. And therefore men have no incentive to be responsible and to be decent, and can get away with the most horrible things under the sun. Here's an explanation. Here's Ruth. Talks about the days when the judges ruled. Now, this is an example of what it means to be a kinsman redeemer, right? Here's Ruth. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons, right? So this was her, Ruth's mother-in-law, right? And they took them wives of the women of Moab, and the name, one was Ophrah and the other one was Ruth, okay? And about 10 years. Then the 2 sons died, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. And she arose, and her daughters-in-law as well, Naomi, and said, I'm going to return to the country of Moab, for she heard in the country of Moab how the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Okay, so the Lord was looking after the people there. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. Okay, so the land of Judah. Naomi said unto her daughters-in-law, Go and return each to their mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. And the Lord grant you that you might find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. And she kissed them. Kiss. This is important. It's going to come later. The kiss. There's a theme here. And they lifted up their voice and wept. And they said unto her, Surely we will return with you unto thy people. Right? Your people are going to be my people. Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. And so Naomi's very concerned with them because they don't have husbands. And like, you're still young. And she says, Are there yet to be more sons in my womb that you may have husbands? She's like, you need to go and find another husband, right? So he can look after you and all that kind of. Turn again and go your way, for I am too old. And she's like, Are you going to wait for my boys, if I have new children, for them to grow up so you can marry them? It's not feasible, right? It's not feasible. And they wept. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. Right, kissed her mother-in-law and departed. But Ruth was loyal. I said, I'm going to stay with you. And she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back to her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. Go with her. And Ruth said, Entreat me not. So she's really loyal. Or to returning from the following after thee. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. And your people shall be my people, and thy God my God. So this is real strong loyalty here. And where you die, I'll die, and there I'll be buried. Right? And so Naomi said, I'm going to change my mind. So they went until they came to Bethlehem. Right? And the city was moved about them, and they said, This is no. So these family members, they all knew each other, right? They recognized her. Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, and so on it be. So there was a name change here. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has. So the name change and stuff. This is Naomi returned. Right, so there you have that situation. Let's go to the next, right, and see what happens. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. Right? And Ruth the Moabitess said, Let me go now into the field and glean with the corn after him, and so on. And she went and gleaned over. And Boaz came from her and said unto the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered, The Lord bless thee. So really coordinated. So again, the reapers, these were his servants. Right? These were Boaz's servants working in the fields. And he says, The Lord be with you. Do you see the respect he has for his servants? And they answered him, The Lord bless thee. Right? And the Boaz said to his servant that set was over the reapers, Whose damsel is he? He's talking about Ruth now. And he said, it is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the and she said, I pray you, let me glean after the reapers, and so on. Boaz said unto Ruth, hearest thou, not my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maiden. So it's, don't go to anyone else's field, stay within my fields, because I'm a kinsman, and I will make sure that you are protected and looked after, and be here with my maidens. Right, you can be here with my maidens. Let thy eyes be on the field, so that they do reap, and so you can. So he's sort of taking her in. She fell on her face and bowed and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes? And so knowledge, seeing that I am a stranger, right? So even though she was an in-law to his brother, right, she's still a foreign woman, right? She's a foreign woman. I'm a stranger, so why are you showing me such mercy, such grace? So this is a good situation here. He said to her, it's shown me everything, that the loyalty that you've shown to your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. It's like you could have left and the land of the nativity. So you've left everything that you know, you've come to be with our people and take us on. So there's in Israel, foreign people were allowed to become part of the community, right? And you see the same thing with Moses back when they were in the So you see the same thing with Moses back in the day when they were during the Exodus, where you had all the tribes that were set, and then you had another tribe, right? A 13th tribe. They were known as the mixed multitude. So they were Egyptians and all kinds of other different nationalities. So you had, so the way the thing would, the camp would be structured is the tabernacle would be in the center, and all the 12 tribes would be camped around, and then the people, the mixed multitude, would be outside of the camp. And after 1 or 2 generations where there was a process of integration, those people were then absorbed into the nation of Israel. So the nation of Israel was a heavily multicultural people, right? So when people try to say that Israel is one race or one, that's pure bollocks. It's a multicultural people, right? All sorts of people. Moses, for example, was married to an Ethiopian woman, right? Was married to an Ethiopian woman. So even there, when people try to be racist, you can't do that, right? Because you know, and Aaron, Moses' brother or brother, his wife was speaking badly against, in a bit of a racist way, against this foreign woman that Moses was married to, this Ethiopian woman, and God punished her with leprosy. So anyone that says that you can say there's racism in the Bible, you can't do that, because God punished. When that instance happened with Moses, God punished them, right? And the patriarch Moses married a foreign woman, married an Ethiopian. So, you know, these things are very, very important. These details that people don't usually see. So you were loyal. The Lord recompensed thy work, and so on and so forth. And she said, let me find favor in thy sight, my Lord. So here is this servant master type of thing, relationship, and it's a close relationship. For thou hast comforted me, spoken friendly to thy handmaid. So she's now a handmaid, right? She's got the status of a handmaid. So because she's no longer an in-law now, because the family tie has been broken because it died, and she's now a widow. So she's now a handmaid. She's a servant. Though I be not like unto one of thine handmaidens. So she's even more different than his other servants. Even more different. And Boaz said to her, at meal time come here, eat of the bread, dip thy morsel in it, and you can come and join us. She's really bringing her in. And now she's dealing with a mother-in-law. Mother said, oh, where have you gleaned? Blessed be he of the Lord who hath not left. Naomi said, now this is Naomi, not left off his kindness to the living and the dead. And Naomi said unto her, this man, by the way, you don't know, you didn't realize, this man is near of kin to us. He's closely related to us. One of our next kinsmen. He's a kinsman redeemer. And this is why, I'm just explaining the kinsman redeemer. This is why the Israelites were not allowed to buy each other as servants in this sense, why it prohibited it. It's because of this cultural peculiarity, right? And he said unto me, thou shalt keep fast by my young men until they have in all my harvest. Good, and so on and so forth. And kept fast by the maidens until the end of the barley harvest. Right. So we go to the next one. My daughter, shall I not seek rest thee? Beware thee, now is Boaz not our kindred, who the maidens thou wast. behold, winnow, and so on. So the story goes on. Right, she came softly, uncovered his feet, came past midnight, he was afraid, and turned himself, and behold, a woman lay at his feet, and he said, Who art thou? She answered, I am Ruth, thine handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over the man hand. Remember that other verse that said that God hates anyone who stretches his garment to cover violence? Remember? Right? So this is an analogy here. So the Bible is intrinsically connected. Here's the garment. Spread therefore thy skirt, thine garment, over thy handmaid, for thou art, so spread it to protect me. Right? This is the analogy. God hates it when you cover up evil, but God is approving when you cover for protection. For thou art near kinsman. And he said, Blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast shown me more kindness in the latter end than in the beginning, inasmuch thou followest not the young men, whether rich or poor. So it's like, you're a good woman. You are not chasing young men, you're not behaving like a slut, basically, chasing the rich man. Does that happen today, ladies and gentlemen? Does that happen today? Right, where women are gold diggers, it's like, if he's not 6 foot and wealthy, I'm not interested, what. And here's a guy, he's like, you've been very kind to me, because rather than chasing around like a hoe, you've been faithful and loyal to me, and you've shown me kindness, right? You've not followed young men, whether poor or rich. Now, my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requirest of me. So she's a maid, she's a servant, and he says, I'm going to do whatever you require of me. Right? Here's the relationship of master to servant. For all the city of my people know that thou art a virtuous woman, and now it is true that I am a near kin, howbeit there is kinsmen nearer than I. So there are people more closely related to you than I am. Tarry this night, and in the morning, and she lay at his feet, and they rose up, came one another. Let it not be known that a woman came to the floor, so that people don't think that funny business go on, to protect her honor, protect her dignity. Bring the veil that her, and so on and so forth. And came mother-in-law, she said, right, 6 measures of barley gave me, and so I said, my daughter, all right, for the man will not be, so, and she said this, sit still, my daughter, says Naomi speaking to Ruth, until thou know the matter will fall. For the man, this a virtuous man, for the man will not be in rest until he have finished the thing this day. He's going to sort out this issue. He's going to redeem her. Went up to the gate, here's the gate again, and sat him down there, and behold, the kinsman so the other family members who Boaz spoke of came by, unto whom he said, Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. So he waited for them and said, sit down here, turn and sit down. We're now in the gate, we must judge, we're going to negotiate. We must understand that in the Bible, when it talks about purchasing, right, when you buy, in the Bible, so in that other verse will say, you may buy of the other people. The word buying, the Jews, the Israelites, those cultures, they do not distinguish between a purchase that is made through the exchange of money versus acquiring via an agreement, and now we go and work together. So I say to you, listen, I will be your servant, and you say, yeah, okay, come with me. Then that will be considered, I have bought your service, your labor, even though I haven't actually given you, I've paid no contract. I'm not buying you from a slave. There's no slave master here. There's no slaver here that they're buying from, right? So whenever they say the purchase has been made, they do not distinguish between purchase made between two people for an object, for a piece of property, or a negotiation between a man and another man for that other man's service, even if money does not exchange hands. Any negotiation, any contract, any agreement is considered, I have purchased, I have bought, I have acquired through this agreement, all right? So whenever they say you may buy, do not think that money is exchanging hands, right? It's not the case, right? Or it's not necessarily the case. Right. Sit down here. And he said to the kinsman Naomi, that has come out of the gate of Moab, out of the country of Moab, she's selling a parcel of land which belonged to her brother. So she still owned that land, right? She still owned that land. And I thought to advertise thee, saying, buy it before the inhabitants. So buy it, and before the elders of my people. So in the public, in front of everyone, redeem these people, redeem your family members. take them on in your family, right? Because part of this redeeming process is to carry on the name of the deceased, right? Which is even the servants and stuff like that. If they received an inheritance, they would carry on the family name. So even the slaves or servants, whatever you want to call it, that were in the house together, they would even take on the name of the family, of the house. They become part of the house. Buy it before the inhabitants and before the elders of it. So this is public, so that there's no dodgy business. Everyone, it's transparent. If thou will redeem it, redeem it. But if thou will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know. For there is none to redeem it beside thee, and I am after thee. And he said, I will redeem it. Then said Boaz, what day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, so if you buy the field from her, thou must buy it also of Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, right? So it was a responsibility that if sort of your brother, your brother died and his wife was let's say my brother dies and his wife is sort of left behind or whatever, it's my in that culture, it would have been my responsibility to provide her, if she didn't have children or whatever, to redeem her into the family, and also to provide her with children in order to continue the name, my brother's name, right? Because there's an inheritance attached to the name of the brother, right? And rights and all these kinds of things, and the woman retained the name, and all the servants retained the name, and so on and so forth, right? The wife of the dead to raise up the name. And the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar my own inheritance. Redeem thou my right to thyself. So I will relinquish my right to you, because I cannot redeem it. Now this was the manner in former time in Israel concerning redeeming and concerning changing. For to confirm all things, a man plucked off his shoe and gave it to his neighbor, and this was a testimony in Israel. Therefore the kinsman said to buy it for thee. So he drew off his shoe and gave it to him. Right. So that is how the redeeming process sort of worked, so that the woman would not be destitute, the family wouldn't be destitute, the servants wouldn't be destitute, so that the land would not be barren, and it would come into a family and it would be looked after, the inheritance, the name of the dead would continue, and all these kinds of things. And the process of a shoe is because it's just a cultural idiosyncrasy. So in those days, if I took off my shoe, if we negotiate for a piece of land, the agreement, I take off my shoe and I give it to you, I'm saying, with this shoe, I walked onto my land and I had the right to walk on that land, to be on that land. I was not trespassing. And so by giving you my shoe, I'm showing you have the right to walk on this land. And that's the symbol of the shoe. You are now, so you, with this shoe, if you walk on that land and you are on that land, you are not a trespasser. You are there as an owner. It's just a cultural peculiarity sort of thing. And if you go through the Bible, there's all kinds of, if you look for the word inheritance, all kinds of inheritance. Inheritance was a big deal, right? Had a great responsibility was attached to inheritance. Jesus Christ himself is part of our inheritance. There is a lot to be said. It's a massive subject, an absolutely massive subject. Right. Now, I want you guys to go slightly back and remember in Exodus where they're talking about if the man is injured and he's bedridden, and it says you must restore him to health. Let me see if I can find it there, just to bring out the verse again, refresh memories. Right, here we go. Let's see. Right, here we go. So it says here, that smote him be quit, only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and ye shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. Will cause him to be thoroughly healed. Okay? So let's go back to the other verse. So the person that smote, you've got to pay for his medical bills, you've got to pay for everything. Now, if we go over to the New, we're now moving into the New Testament, right? Into the New Testament, because people also say, well, the New Testament, it doesn't say anything. So we've established the Old Testament, right? We've established the Old Testament. We're moving into the New. We've seen what's going on there. The Old Testament does not does not condone. The Old Testament does not condone or endorse or say as ideal or anything like that, that slavery of the kind that people are trying to impute to the Bible as something where people are free to beat and abuse and rape and murder. This is dishonest. This is absolute dishonesty if anyone wishes to say that of the Bible. The Bible has nothing to do with the kind of slavery that was seen in the antebellum South, in the transatlantic slave trade, and so it's nothing to do, right? So we've established the Old Testament, nothing. Now, what does the New Testament say? Now, in the New Testament, here's a very interesting story, ties back to that, where it says the person is responsible, if the person's been injured, to pay his medical bills. Now, here is a story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus tells the story. This is a throwback. And Jesus answered, said, a certain man went from Jerusalem, Jericho, and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment, and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance came down a certain priest, and when he saw him, he passed on the other side. So the reason why Jesus is telling the story is because Jesus is establishing the fact that Israel were not following the commandments that of how people were to be treated, right? Was showing the unrighteousness of Israel, and that they were unrighteous, that they were disobeying God's express requirements for his people, even though this is an unfortunate situation that had to be regulated and so on, but those regulations were being disobeyed. And God sets up a standard of righteousness here, a standard of righteousness. The priest, when he saw him, passed by on the other side, and likewise the Levite, when he was at that place, came and looked on it and passed by the other side. But a certain Samaritan, so this is a Samaritan, they were seen as the lowest of the low, he journeyed. So Jesus, one of the reasons people got so annoyed with Jesus, he's uplifting a Samaritan here, right? So again, you can't read in the Bible and say that prejudice against other races is legitimate, because Christ constantly lifts up foreign people. As he journeyed, came here where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him, bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow when he departed, he took 2 pence and gave to the host, and said unto them, take care of him. Whatever thou spendest, when I come again, I will repay thee. Now, which of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? And he said, he that showed mercy on him. Then Jesus said unto him, go and do thou likewise. So the standard of behavior throughout the entire Bible, and one of the reasons why the Samaritan was lifted up as such an example, even though he was not the one that injured the man, he still took it upon himself to heal him and pay for his medical bills and to look after him. So that this man was even better than the Israelites who were disobeying this. So the Samaritan embodied the law of Israel better, the law of Israel as commanded by God, better than even the Israelites themselves were doing. And Jesus was pointing this fact out. He was saying to the Israelites, you've lost your way. It's one of the reasons why Jesus actually eventually came. It was prophesied and all, but Jesus came. One of the reasons is because to show the Israelites how they had gone astray. They weren't practicing what they had been told. It's a profound message. Right. Before we go there, let's go here. Does the New Testament endorse slavery? The answer is no. Christians could not change the legal system. There was no suffrage. So when we're talking about Christianity in the time of Jesus, you need to understand that whatever laws and protections and things like that were in place for Israel in the Old Testament now were no longer applicable in the New Testament. Why? Because Israel was now under Roman occupation. Israel was now slave to the Roman Empire. Okay? There was nothing that they could do. There was nothing. So when you say, they didn't say what, they couldn't abolish slavery because they weren't in control of their own land. They were under Roman rule. Okay, so there was no suffrage. They couldn't vote. They couldn't everything. They were not citizens. They were subjects to the Roman Empire. So there's nothing they could do about it. Okay. However, nevertheless, within this terrible situation that Rome had the worst of slavery, right? Could abuse, could torture. And we're going to get there. The Christians established a subculture that transcended class, economic, and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to get to that, and we'll see, right? So here, desktop. We see desktop. Why am I saying desktop? Yeah. Right. Christians could not change the legal system. Slaves who rebelled would be executed under Roman law. And there was a Roman limit to the emancipation of slaves. So in Lux Fulvia Canina. Now, Caninia. In 2nd BC, you could only free 2 of 3 slaves, a half, so 4 of 10 slaves, a third, 11 of 30 slaves, right? Lex Alea Sentia AD 4, slaves under 30 cannot be freed without legal procedure, and slaves manumitted under 30 could never be a citizen. So when Jesus, so when the Bible says, you know, slaves obey your masters and all that kind of stuff, it's because they realize that in the situation that anything, they're now under Roman law, right? They could not escape, because if they did, they'd be killed. It was not like in the Israel times where they could escape and they were not allowed to be brought back. They were free, and any abuse meant that they had to be freed and stuff. They were now under Roman law. So when these things that they're saying, because one of the things during this time, you had a lot of like zealots and stuff like that. You had political strife, and a lot of Jewish people were going in military campaigns against Rome. And as a result, eventually in 70 AD, because of all of these campaigns, Rome eventually came and committed like virtual genocide, basically wiped out, destroyed, flattened Jerusalem, laid siege, and the siege was so savage that mothers were eating their own children. They were so hungry. Okay, and in order to prevent this Roman backlash, the recommendations were given based on the situation at the time. So when he was saying slaves obey your masters and stuff like that, he's like, it profits you nothing to just be killed, right? But rather show Christian grace and Christian faithfulness and stuff like that, and be loyal to your masters, and in whatever way you can. And maybe you can be free, but it doesn't profit you to be free before the age of 30, because you couldn't become a citizen, right? So it's better to wait, because while you were the servant, at least of Roman, who was a citizen, you had the protection of the Roman lord, because you belonged to him, rather than going and rebelling and stuff, where he could then either execute you, and even if you got your freedom somehow you couldn't become a citizen, and therefore you could still be subject, that you could be retaken as a slave and be subject to abuse and all kinds of things. So Rome was an overwhelming force, an overwhelming power, and they had to work accordingly, right, to the time, right? And the New Testament teaching on slavery, right? So love others as Christ loved us. So everyone, we're commanded to love each other as brothers and sisters. So again, slavery is gone if we're supposed to love each other. Even if a person is your servant, you're supposed to love him as brothers and sisters, which means no mistreatment, no nothing, right? No beating, no anything. There was brotherhood. This whole idea of calling each other brother and sister, this is a Christian ideology. Kissing, right? Remember earlier on I said about the kissing? Pay attention to that word. There's the kissing, right? There was laws that in the Christian society, they said when we meet, you kiss a holy kiss, a Christian kiss. That means whether master or slave or rich or poor, whatever, you had to kiss each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. And this meant that you were tearing down the social barriers within the Christian society, and that's how they managed it, right? That's how they manage remember earlier on I said you cannot change a society top down, you have to change it bottom up. And this is how Christians in those days did it. They changed society to eventually what happened is because the Christians had such a good ethic and a good lifestyle and broke down these social barriers and stuff like that, The religion was very winsome, and eventually they managed to convert people despite all of the savage persecutions by Nero and all these people. Eventually Rome became Christian under Constantine and under people that subsequent, because it won them over. And that is the only way. This is why, if you're a Christian, any Christian is going out there picketing and just being just totally bloody obnoxious, right? Stop doing that. You are not going to change society until A, you change your own heart, your own mind, your own soul, right? Like Jordan Peterson says, clean your room, okay? And you cannot change society unless you work for changing the hearts and minds of other people. You're not going to achieve that by protesting. You're not going to achieve that by enacting tyrannical laws. You will only achieve that by treating other people as brothers and sisters in a winsome manner, in going among the people and helping people and showing the Christian ethic and the Christian lifestyle. Not by doing this, talking. Not going to help. Not going to help. Right? Ephesians, we're going to read this. Ephesians 6:9, you're not allowed to threaten. It shows God's preference for the masters. Colossians, what is right and equal, and Philemon, no longer slaves. And so we're going to get to those particular passages over there. So if we go, so Ephesians, as I mentioned before, children, obey your parents, for this is right. Fathers, provoke not your children. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Here's the caveat: as unto Christ, right? So basically, the Christian is required, and this stands even today. As a Christian, I have to obey the law of the land, only unless the only time I need to refuse, I'm allowed by God to refuse to obey the law of the land, is when the law of the land commands me to do something that that God says I'm not allowed to do. So if the law says that I must commit adultery or I must steal or whatever, I must disobey that law. Okay? So that's the caveat in this particular thing. In singleness, also as unto Christ. So do no more than so you are to obey your masters only insofar as they do nothing that impinges on your duty to Christ, right? Not with eye service or men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, because ultimately you're serving Christ. Again, ultimately we all serve Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. So being good, being decent. And what a lot of people don't realize is you can convert people. You can even convert a mean son of a gun by being decent to them. Right? With goodwill, doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. So again, there's no such thing as bond or free, but God understands that in this situation, there's not a lot of people can do in this situation under Rome. There's not much he can do, but in the Christian faith, bond or free, there's no difference. And ye masters, do the same things unto them. Forbearing, threatening. You are not allowed to threaten. Knowing that your master also in heaven is in heaven, neither is there respect of persons with him. So masters, the same thing, is giving the same instruction to masters. Right? So any Roman, right, because there were Roman citizens that converted to Christianity, and they would have had slaves. Right, but because of the system that they were in, they had certain legal constraints with what they could do. So in order to both honor God and abide by the law, because obviously if they broke the law, then there would be a problem. He says, if you are a Roman and you're a Christian, you happen to have slaves, and there's nothing you can do about that situation, he says, treat them well, treat them with respect, treat them with dignity, don't abuse them, and all that kind of stuff. So here is a clear cut. So again, we go back to the thing that I was saying. The idea where you can just simply ban things is childish and idiotic, and does not take stock and account of the real life implications of what happens to real flesh and blood people on the ground in any particular time in history. Right? Like those women who lost those jobs because of those stupid feminists. And then many other things, like the kids who end up in prison because they're addicted to drugs and stuff like that, because of ridiculous anti-drug laws that go too far, that don't take cognizance of the fact that sometimes people have problems at home, that sometimes people have mental illness and things of that sort, that sometimes there's problem, that some people are vulnerable, right? You can't just ban just like that and criminalize, because it's idiotic. People still suffer, right? So whenever someone comes up and says, oh, God should have said this, who the hell are you to say what God should or should not say, where you know nothing of what it was like? You know literally nothing of what it was like. That's presumption. You are being arrogant because you're assuming that you know that it was viable to just, oh, let's just go and ban. And the Romans wouldn't have brought the wrath of Rome down and just slaughtered people. You got to think about these things. It's ridiculous, right? Just do it. You know, like these again, these far leftists. Oh, just increase minimum wage. Just give people money. And they're too stupid to realize that during the apartheid regime, minimum wage was designed to price black people out of competition. Minimum wage laws were designed in apartheid South Africa for the express purpose to make black people not be able to compete in the free market. Right? And so you need to understand that these stupid activists that are saying we must bring in these minimum wage laws, they're too stupid to understand that the politicians that want to bring minimum wage laws in have lied to you and are not revealing the fact that minimum wage laws are specifically designed to aggravate the situation of poor people, because it was invented in the apartheid times. Right? So it's this ignorant, oh, because we have this ideology and we have no idea how things actually work in the real world, we must declare, and because I say so, and if God doesn't do what I say and what I think is right, therefore God is evil. You know, piss off. You know, who the hell are you to know, sort of thing? And I'm not talking to you, the viewer, right? The guy who answered the question, Mr. I forget his name, but viewer, I'm not saying you must piss off or anything, because you asked legitimate questions and you were respectful. But most other people that approach with this ridiculous arrogance, is like, who the hell are you? Do you really understand? Are you an anthropologist or historian that you really know what went on? You don't know, right? And so you can't just say that, because even today people are calling for things, and like like this climate change business, this Greta Thunberg moron, she doesn't realize that what she's calling for will basically prevent third world countries from developing. So one half of the people are jumping up and down screaming about poverty in Africa, how terrible it is. Meanwhile, on the other hand, with the climate stuff, or the climate change stuff, they want to bring on laws that will specifically prevent Africa from developing so that it can pull itself out of poverty. It's idiotic. Totally idiotic. Yes, we must understand that we mustn't pollute and look after our environment, because again, for the Christian, stewardship over the environment as well, the stewardship applies to everything, right? Yes, we must look after, but at the same time, we need to realize that there are real life consequences to flesh and blood people, right? And you can't just go like a bull in a china shop, half-cocked with an ideology, think everyone must just do as I say, otherwise they're evil. It's idiotic, right? Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord in the power of his might, put on the and be able. So there we go. Stand against the devil. Here's another one. Colossians. Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. So even the masters have a master, which is God. And the master serves the master. And his responsibility as a master is to make sure that he gives just and equal to his servants. Commandment. Right? Philemon, not now as a servant, but above a servant, a brother beloved, specially to me, but how much more unto thee, both in flesh and in the Lord. Right? Philemon is basically talking, there was actually a slave or a servant who escaped, and the church is being instructed, take the slave in and treat him like a brother. Right? He's above a servant, even though he might have been a servant, whatever. No matter, you treat him like a brother, like he's one of your own. Here we go. Remember I spoke about the kiss? Right? Great way off, ran and fell and kissed him. Right? Yet spake, behold a multitude, and Judas, Why did Judas kiss Jesus? Why did he betray him with a kiss? Right? Betrays the Son of Man with a kiss, and all wept, so fell on Paul's neck and kissed him. Why did Judas betray Jesus with a kiss? Because a kiss was peculiar, a peculiar habit of the Christians. That's how they greeted each other. And Judas betrayed. That's why it's such a betrayal. That's why it was such a massive betrayal for Judas to not just point out, but to kiss Jesus. It's the ultimate, it was scum of the earth to go and kiss Jesus, because this holy kiss was a signal, a sign of being very, very close. You are my brother. Because you don't kiss a random stranger, you kiss someone who is close to you. He's your brother in Christ, and they were commanded. You're going to see here in the verses here, all the brethren greet you. Greet ye one another with a holy kiss. Whether slave, whether bond, whether master, whether Roman, whether Ethiopian, whether Israelite, doesn't matter. You all kiss each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. Corinthians, greet one another with a holy kiss. Thessalonians, greet all brethren with a holy kiss. Greet ye one another with a kiss of charity. Peace be with you all that are in Christ. All that are in Christ. Not some, or all that are in Christ. And when you look at when you study the history of the Christian church in Rome, you will see that the Christians got a subculture, that everyone from all walks of life. You hear the story of the centurion called Jesus. Jesus, please come and heal my servant. Right? The centurion, who himself having been a Christian, Jesus, please come and heal my servant. Again, there's that throwback to the thing. If the servant is ill, you look after him. This was the ethic. The Christian centurion, I'm going to be responsible for the welfare of my servant. Just because he's my servant does not mean I mistreat him. Jesus, because I've concerned my servant, because of this brotherly love, that I will greet my servant with a kiss and treat him like a brother in Christ. Even though as a centurion I am his master, but in the Lord we are equals. Jesus, please come and heal my servant. And that was the situation over there. Come and heal him. And so on and so forth. Right? Here's another one. There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond nor free, neither male or female, for you are all the one in Christ. There we go. It settles the issue. Completely settles the issue. Does the Bible condone slavery? Does the Bible say slavery is ideal? Does the Bible say that slavery is good? Does the Bible say that slavery should be done? Rubbish. It is absolutely, utterly untrue. You will not find anything in the Bible that says that obliges you to keep slaves, and furthermore, like something like I discussed with my friend on Facebook. His name is Stanley Bennett, Mr. Stanley Bennett, which I discussed with him, that one thing that the Christians know 100%, Moses wrote 2 laws. He wrote the law of the 10 commandments of God. He took the tablet of stone and put it inside the Ark of the Covenant. Is a symbol of God's throne, his kingdom, the law upon which God's kingdom is established. The law of 10 commandments put inside the Ark, right? There was a little thing there and put in there. And then he wrote another book of the law, right? Which put next to the Ark, beside the Ark, next to it, which was temporary. Was designed to be temporary. And they say it's the law contained in ordinances, right? That was a witness against us, right? And the Bible calls it says it was a witness against us. It says, because you people are evil, because you people are sinful, I'm therefore in a position where I'm forced, if I'm not going to override your free will, I am forced to put in these measures because you people are evil, because you're stiff-necked. And I'm forced to do this because you are so stubborn, and because you will not abide by my ideal law. Then, in order to move everyone along, so remember, creation, fall, redemption. Redemption is to get people back to the original state. In order to move you forward, to not be pedantic and to try be as merciful with people as possible, because innocent people get caught in the crossfire. I then, by necessity, I have to bring in this law containing ordinances as a temporary measure, right? And then in the New Testament, it says that Jesus Christ, that the law was abrogated. It was nailed to the cross, and it is no longer applicable. That's why Christians, we no longer sacrifice. We no longer do any of those things. None of it is applicable. So even if the Old Testament had horrible slave laws, even if that was the case, the fact that it is crystal clear, the Apostle Paul says it was nailed to the cross. The law containing ordinances was nailed to the cross. Christ's 10 commandments still stands because it's in the ark, but the law containing ordinances, the book of the law that Moses wrote, that was taken out of the way at the death of Jesus Christ, and it was nailed to the cross. It was a witness against us, it was a testament of our sinfulness and how God necessarily had to deal with us because of our sinful nature, because of our sinful ways, right? And that was done away with. So even if it had terrible laws in there, it was temporary, and it had to be taken away, and there was no justification for any Christian after the death of Christ to ever look back in the Old Testament and say, we need to do that again. None whatsoever. Paul, the Apostle Paul, just drove a nail through that, right? It was nailed to the cross. End of story. So, Mr. Bennett, I apologize for the length, because there needs to be... it's difficult. It's like we say, I subscribe to a coherentist view. All the things mesh to get an overview. So the background needs to be there. I hope this answers your questions sincerely and, without bias and stuff like that. It's not because I'm trying, because I freely admit this is not a thing. And the Israelites, the Bible is unique. The Bible is unique in Middle Eastern religions and literature to show and the sins of its own people and its kings. Right? It lists the sins of Moses. It lists all the imperfections of the people. It doesn't paint them as wonderful people, right? Unlike Egyptian history and stuff like that. Like Egyptians, if they lost a war, they would lie about it, and in their hieroglyphics they would say that they won the war even though they'd lost it. Right, so this is a unique document amongst ancient Near Eastern culture and text. Very, very unique. They don't hide the fact that the Jewish people were imperfect, that they were sinful, and often they were worse than the heathen. And it's the same thing today. Same thing today. Christians, we are not better than atheists. I'm not better than you just because I'm a Christian. Right? Me and you are on the same level, on the exact same level. I need God as much as you do, right? You might not think so. Fair enough, fair enough. But we're on the same level. I'm a sinner, you're a sinner, we're all sinners. We're on the same boat, and you're my brother. That's how I should treat you. We're brothers. That's how I should view you, right? And I hope, that this settles the question. Right? Whatever it is that you and others like yourself and other atheists out there are trying to force into the Bible, it's simply not there. Not there. Because if it was, I wouldn't be a Christian. Simple as that, right? I've been in my past. I've left religions. I've left Christianity before, right? I've left Christianity. I've left Buddhism. I've left Hinduism. I've left all these things. I have no problem leaving the Christian faith. So if it was there, I wouldn't be a Christian. It's that simple, right? I'm not one of those Christians that was raised and I'm thinking, no, I'm not like that. If it was true, what you say, it just I wouldn't be a Christian. And from all of the evidence that I can garner, it's just not there. It's just not there. This evil thing that you are trying, that you see with God and with the Old Testament law and trying to impute, it's not there. I cannot stress this enough. It's just simply not there if you take everything into account. And I guarantee you right now, right, that everything I've just said in this video, right, because I know that I recommended What Do You Meme? I recommended his video simply because he does very succinct, short responses to some of the verses. But even I've never seen anyone bring up the points that I've never seen anyone do what I've just done, ever, which is one of the reasons why I asked you permission if you were okay with me doing this video. I've never seen anyone wrong. one person. His name is Peter Williams. Peter Williams. I will link his video because I've actually used some of his resources and stuff like that. He's the only other person who's done anything near what I've just done. And you can go into the street right now, go to the nearest church, and what I've just said, most of them will not know. Most of the Christians there, I guarantee you, won't know this, because Christians are ignorant. Christians are just as ignorant. And this is a problem within the Christian community, that we're very, very ignorant. So what you guys say about Christians being ignorant, that they just blindly accept their faith, is true in a lot of ways. It really, really is true in a lot of ways. Very few Christians know what I've just put out there, which is one of the reasons, like I said, why I put this video out. Anyway, my friend, Mr. Bennett, I hope this satisfied you. I look forward to further conversations. You brought up the morality issue. I'd be happy to address that with you. That'll be a great conversation. If you are still keen, pop it in the comments below. We can go with that. I hope this satisfies you. This is the best I can do with the knowledge that I have. And I really hope this settles the issue, because I'd like you to be a Christian. I'm going to state my bias. I would, having been a Christian now for 5 years, having come out of where I used to be where you are, that's the way to go. It's the way to go. It's changed my life. I used to be and the problem is and this is another philosophical question for a long time. I could find nothing in the other faiths that justified why I should be different. And Christianity it clenches it, man. It changes your life. It really does. If you can give it a good go, please, for sure. But that said, and for those of you, ladies and gentlemen, everyone else, thank you for watching. I hope this helps you with your view of the issue. If you're a Christian, don't get so defensive about it. Yeah, bad things happen in the Bible, man, for sure. It's because we're in sin. And if you're an atheist watching this, try to be more fair. And I know Christians aren't always fair, and I know you don't always want to be, because Christians aren't always fair with you. They really aren't. Believe me, I know. I used to be I know. I've been where you are. I know what it's like. Even now, when I say certain things and I preach on certain things, a lot of Christians, and they totally behave like a bunch of retards. Really, really do, because they're so ignorant, right? And I appreciate that. I understand that, but try it for your own sake, for you as an individual. Try and deal as honestly as you can. And I know that you have no reason to, but read the Bible and study it as carefully as possible when you're raising these issues, because the answers are there. They really are there. And even if you don't believe it, just take it for what it is, and you'll see. It's not that bad, right? Even if Christianity is false, it's not that bad. Right? Reject Christianity. If you're an atheist, and that's my appeal to you. If you reject Christianity, do it because it's not true. Okay? Don't do it because you've tried to find some evil or some whatever in it that's not there. So if it's not true, then it's not true. Then then just reject it on that basis. Simple as that, right? Fair enough. But all that other stuff is not necessary. And I encourage you guys to go to my playlist where I talk about biblical content. You'll see there as well. Most of those things that Sam Harris brings up, he's not wrestling with the text, right? At all. Anyway, I've spoken long enough, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you very much for viewing this and for giving it a shot. Mr. Bennett, I thank you for giving this a shot and for giving me a chance. Right, and I hope I've risen to the occasion. That's all I can do. And here on forward, God bless you, man. And that's all I can say, really. And I hope you'll come to this side of the fence one day. Really, really, because the world sucks, man. And it's headed, and there's more out there than what our senses can tell us. There's more. And And I know this might be what, but you feel it. You must feel it. There's more, you know. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I hope this helps you. Goodbye and God bless.